I've never seen this place before. I've been to the cemetery once or twice, but I had no idea that this existed, and I'm just overwhelmingly impressed. I also feel a bit of a fraud because I'm not in the Gandhi tradition. I'm very interested in Gandhi, but I don't know much about him. Much I'll learn some today. I have been in India. I've been in the place where he was assassinated, and that was a kind of historical moment for me. But it did the whole business of pacifism and non-violence is different to my tradition. I wasn't brought up in that way at all. In fact, I was quite the opposite. The school I went to when I was evacuated to Canada during the war, I was a bugler in uniform, aged 11. I was quite good as a bugler. I could rally the troops quite quickly, but at age 11. When I came back to another school in England, there was a cadet corps which was part of the school. It's absolutely normal, like the rugby team was the cadet corps, the same sort of basis of things, and they were always involved in the holiest things. We had great Blessed Sacrament processions, and little boys with rifles went around the procession kind of guarding it, and that was quite normal to me. I never thought nothing about it. And I was called up into the army, which I went to with great enthusiasm, but thank God I never had to do anything horrible, but I would have done. I was trained to do things that were horrible, and I would have done them if I'd ever been ordered to do so. Thank God I was in Belfast, but before any of the troubles broke out. You may wonder how old I am. I'm not going to tell you. So I went through all that kind of thing, and it only actually I woke up to my obligations and my possibilities, speaking as a Christian, the things that I should be doing. And it was much later in life when I was really just been ordained, and I was in a parish in Kensington. And I remember on Easter Monday of 1959, we were a great marriage factory, our church. We could turn out endless numbers of marriages on a good day, and I had 4 marriages to get through on that day, Easter Monday, and I liked my brides to be on time, and late brides annoyed me very considerably, and I said some uncharitable things for people who turned up late. But that day I had four brides, and they were all late. They were extremely late, and I was furious in a pious way. And I said, what on earth is going on here? Why aren't these women turning up properly and getting ready for their great moment in life? And I discovered some hooligans called the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament had been marching from Aldermaston into London, and they were coming down Kensington High Street and making it impossible for anybody with a car or a taxi or to get anywhere near the church. That's why we were delayed, by these dreadful people who were chanting some sort of a shout, and I thought absolutely ridiculous. I went out and said to them, "What I thought, you are upsetting people like me. It's very annoying. Why don't you go away? Why don't you go away and play your game somewhere else?" And that was my introduction to the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which was a good way to start in a way. And then I got involved in something called Pax Christi, which is a Catholic peace movement, but not just open to Catholics. And Pax Christi, which has bases in many parts of the world, made me start thinking about peace generally. And later on, I bumped into a wonderful man called Archbishop Thomas Roberts, who was a Jesuit, and he was the Archbishop of Bombay. And he took me aside, and he said, "Now you've learnt all this moral theology about the just wars and all that sort of thing," which I thought I had. He said, "How do you justify nuclear weapons?" I thought, well, justify them? I mean, they keep the peace, don't they? And he said, yes. Do they keep the peace? We haven't had much peace, have we? And he said, in order to keep the peace, you've got to be willing to commit mass murder, haven't you? So I thought then, that kind of a light went on in my head, that the whole business of so-called deterrence rests on the most wicked intentions by all sorts of people. So I began to get involved then, and got involved more more effectively in CND and got active in all sorts of ways in the ups and in the downs. There were plenty of ups, enormous performance in Hyde Park on 3 or 4 occasions when you could peep. The place was packed from Marble Arch down to Hyde Park Corner, utterly packed, and that was very exciting. There were other times when CND almost faded out of the picture. We had committee meetings that involved about 8 or 10 people of a national organisation. So there were ups and there were downs, but I've always been with them and believed in them. And I think that it's been a worthwhile cause all the way through. I find it myself difficult to realize that I went through a legal degree. I did law. I went through a legal degree at university, and the whole issue of war and law never really impinged at all. We learned a lot about contracts. We learned about crimes, people who commit murders, things like that, and robbery, and how to be a good juror, and blah, blah, blah. But the actual issue of peace and war didn't come up in my legal studies, didn't come up at all. And it was some time later that I discovered this little booklet, which some of you may recognize. It's the Charter of the United Nations. It was actually signed in 1945, I think April or May 45, and I went to university in 49. So they had no excuse for not showing us this. Well, you have no excuse now. You have no excuse, because where would you get one of these documents? You wouldn't. You wouldn't. The United Nations Association don't stock them. You have to get them from New York or get them from Brussels. You can go to a major bookshop and order them, but they indeed will get them from New York or Brussels. So you can't go into a shop and order one over the counter. And it's a critical document for anybody concerned with peace and war, but most people know nothing about it. I brought along, I've got a couple more, but you could have as many as you like. Those are the preambles to the UN Charter, which I impertinently had printed out without anybody's permission, and I now sneak around churches and other halls and trade union buildings, and I stick them up on their notice boards when they're not looking. See, I always think that non-violence requires a bit of action as well as sitting around being non-violent, and I think a little direct action is useful. And how does the Charter start? We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's how it begins, and it's an unknown document in this country. It is actually unknown. I go to a lot of schools, they've never seen the whole charter, and they've certainly never seen the preamble. So if I leave you with any one thought today, and I'm not going to go rabbiting on for too long because I've been told to shut up. Well, I haven't been told to be shut up yet, but I will be, I can see that. So if you want some of these and get them stuck up, please do. My initial tradition was of doubtfulness about people who call themselves pacifists. I was doubtful. And this impression was rather reinforced when I was on television some time ago. And when we went into the room, it was meant to be on peace and war, we were divided into pacifists and non-pacifists. And I was put into the pacifist scene. And a man was next to me. I didn't know who he was at all. And he was asked a question. He said, if you discovered a burglar busy attacking your wife, what would you do? And he said, I couldn't believe it. He said, I would pray for them both. I said, what absolute nonsense. I said, I should thump him as hard as I could. And that moved me from the pacifist to the non-pacifist side of the room immediately. So I think we need a change of thought and a definition of what actually we're talking about. Our present Pope, Francis, has been brilliant in lots of ways. And I'm not embarrassed to say that here in a different community, but he has. But up before that, there were, on the issue of peace and war, there were all sorts of ambiguities. I remember Cardinal Hume once writing a big letter in the Times, and he said if nuclear deterrence ever fails, we will move into a new situation. And that was the end of the article. And the next day, someone said, I presume His Eminence means heaven, because that's exactly what it would have meant. So the disconnect between deterrence and use was so dramatic in the church, in most of the churches, that they were split apart. We saw it the other day down at Westminster Abbey, a great ceremony of Thanksgiving in Westminster Abbey for 50 years of nuclear deterrence. Some of us were standing outside making a fuss, and we felt rather rude because all these nice sailors came along who thought they'd done such a good job. But I thought, no, not such a good job after all. Gandhi, I've learnt a bit about Gandhi, and from Gandhi I've learnt about Mother Teresa's non-violence, about Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Anybody know about him? Because I think he's an absolutely significant man. He's not nearly as famous as Gandhi, but he was quite remarkable. And Martin Luther King, the collapse of East Germany was all non-violent activity in the Gandhian spirit, and it was, and it's possible. So I think that we have not only to have an attitude to non-violence, etc., but we also have to have a strong commitment to taking up social change, to change the things that are intolerable, and to begin to persuade other people to do that. I mean, producing charter copies, that was only one thing, but there's so many things we could do. I have the greatest admiration for the campaign against the arms trade, which is about 25 years old. One of the great disgusting sores in our society is that we sell weapons as often as we can to as many people as we can. That's what it's about. We were down the other day outside the big Excel Centre in East London while there was an exhibition going on inside. I remember, and one of the great problems we have today is charity legislation. I remember saying to somebody from a major charity who was complaining about the bombing of people in Yemen, I said, yes, how do you feel about where the bombs came from? And he said, how do you mean where I said, well, we sell the bombs to Saudi Arabia and the Saudis then drop them on Yemen. But why are you only complaining about the dropping of the bombs? Why aren't you complaining about the manufacture and the selling of the bombs? So charity legislation sounds nice, but it also has got a great brake on social progress, and social progress we've got to be about. I'm going to end now because I think I'm quite close to someone's shouting, shut up. Well, you're too polite to shout, shut up, but I think we've got great problems. One is ignorance. Most people have no idea what all this is about. No idea. And that's why the thing like the preamble is so important. And we've got political apathy. People, the politics is somewhere out there. They don't, until Boris Johnson does something stupid, people don't really wake up to something. There is some decision-making body. We're not really involved. And even in local terms, we're not. Where I live in Haringey, we don't know anything about what goes on in the Haringey Town Council. We know nothing at all about it. We should do. We should be politically aware and active. And change does happen. And I think we can encourage ourselves looking back. Change happens in lots of ways. Imagine if you were brought up in the beginning of the 19th century, you'd have known something about the Peterloo massacre. Troops marching into a suburb of Manchester and slaughtering lots of innocent people. Women's votes, it was all ridiculous at one time, but it took a campaign of 30 years or something, women's votes came about. Slavery, the most respectable groups, including church bishops, were running slave systems and not thinking it was immoral. But it's changed now. We don't do that anymore, thank God. We had intolerable working lives, but now we have something like a decent working week. Perhaps Corbyn will do something different about that. We have an efficient police system. In the 18th century, you wouldn't have gone out if you were middle class without a torch and a couple of servants and a sword. You wouldn't have gone wandering around London. But now we've got all kinds of ways in which we deal with. Right. So all I'm saying is that social progress happens, and I think we should never sit on our laurels and say, well, we're good people, and we have to really look at our society and see what we could do to change it, because it's a society where the rich and the poor are grossly divided, not just internationally, but in this country as well. And the idea that we should somehow resent the idea that refugees come across the Channel, they should be welcomed with red carpets and given honours and not treated like dissidents or difficult people, like the Italians have been dealing with them. So those are some of the thoughts. Now, when somewhere on the back, you'll find all sorts of bits and pieces of free literature, which you're welcome to take. I find if it's free, it goes much more quickly than you have to pay for it. So please take whatever you've got. And now I think I now have to shut up and let somebody else come up here and do something more significant. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me.
I will comment on them or take them further.
Well, thank you very much, Lord Clark, and thank you very much to the Gandhi Foundation as well as the Brahma Kumaris Foundation for organizing and hosting this event and inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you all. Well, I do agree a lot with what Bruce Kent has said, and I also started the same way. I became an activist at a very young age when I was 16, and it was because there was a big dam project funded by the World Bank, which was going to displace around 100,000 of our own people and destroy 300,000 hectares of their ancestral lands, our fields, as well as our burial sites. So as a student, I was in Manila because I got a scholarship. I was sort of brought in to help in the campaign against the big dam. This is the Chico River Dam hydroelectric project, and I did go to the communities to organize, and the communities were bombed, they were militarized, there was a big numbers of military people, our leaders were arrested, and we didn't know what to do because it was already martial law. 1972, it was martial law in the Philippines. We didn't know what to do. Then that's the first time, actually, for many of us to hear about the United Nations, that there's such a thing as the United Nations, that there's a charter on human rights of the United Nations. So we thought, maybe we should go and complain, because we cannot complain in our country because you will be arrested if you are going against any project of the dictator. So we learned about it, and we wrote a letter. Our elders wrote a letter to Robert McNamara, who was then the president of the World Bank, and we said, how dare you come and destroy our community? We are living peacefully. We have been living here since time immemorial, and why are you doing this without even asking us whether we agree to this project or not? So anyway, then we started going to the UN to complain, and that's where we discovered that there's a UN working group on the rights of indigenous peoples. We learned about the charter, and we started engaging with the process of developing an international instrument to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. And this is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is this document which was adopted by the UN General Assembly. After 25 years of lobbying, finally they adopted it in 2007. So this is the 12th year that the declaration has existed. But clearly this UN instrument defines clearly what our rights are, that we cannot be displaced from our communities by projects or by laws without obtaining our free prior informed consent. And we should be secure in our places, and violence like genocide and the removal of people from their places, the removal of children from their community, from their families to be put in another family it should not be allowed. So this is it has 47 articles, and we use it very extensively to fight for our rights and to not to resort to violence. You know, many indigenous peoples, I have been visiting many countries since I assumed the post as a rapporteur in 2014, and you can can understand clearly why indigenous peoples in the end will have to resort to some kind of violence to be able to protect their lands. But a lot of the experiences that we went through taught us that actually we cannot really achieve much, if we align ourselves with those who are engaged in armed conflicts. Because several indigenous peoples, for instance, in Colombia, some of them have been recruited by the FARC, the same in the Philippines, where some indigenous peoples have become part of the New People's Army. But what I have seen is that the extent of militarization that happens in their communities becomes even stronger, and the cycle of violence repeats over and over again. Even if there are peace agreements reached, if the situation is such that the armed groups continue to exist, and then indigenous peoples become the victims, both from the violence of the army, but also the violence of the left. So that is the situation that many indigenous peoples face. And nowadays, indigenous peoples believe that it's really through non-violence and active resistance that they can achieve the goals that they are fighting for, that they can get the rights to be recognized and protected. And of course, using the instruments that have been agreed upon internationally and putting pressure on the government. So in my evolution as an activist, I also have that realization that while you can understand why indigenous people sometimes resort to violence and join groups that are fighting against the state, in the end, this is not really going to result in anything that's going to be, more sustainable for them in terms of peace, as well as in terms of development and environmental, integrity. So many indigenous peoples now who are fighting against big mining corporations, extractive industries, hydroelectric dams, or the expansion of agricultural plantations which displace them, have opted to organize themselves and to do massive demonstrations, against the interests that are promoting this. And recently, the recent demonstrations that we have seen is in Brazil. I've done a visit to Brazil, and I have seen how the indigenous peoples are being subjected to violence in their everyday life. The Kayowang Guarani in Mato Grosso, for instance, I saw them living in tents, and there's a security guard of the agribusiness corporation planting soya and having ranches, shooting at them, and that's why they were displaced from their communities. But they have opted to really fight in a more peaceful way, and even if they have all the people who were killed in the place where they're living, which are just tents, but they continue to assert their rights, and they go to as far as Sao Paulo to protest. So I think this is one step that made me understand the Gandhian philosophy, and especially at this time where there is a lot of untruth, alternative facts, fake news, and in a time where a lot of violence is happening because of these national populist heads of states like my own president, Duterte, Bolsonaro. All these people are really fomenting violence by saying that indigenous peoples have too much land and they don't produce, as they should. They don't contribute to economic growth because they are just sitting on these lands. That kind of view has really pushed a lot of this economic and political interest to continue extracting in these communities. So I think that what is needed for now is really for all of us to join hands to protest against this historical and continuing injustice against indigenous peoples who have protected the last remaining rainforests of the world today, where 80% of the world's biodiversity they are the ones keeping this, they are the ones protecting this. And of course, they are contributing significantly to mitigating climate change by saving and laying their lives for the forests that are their ancestral territories, and that where all the flora and the fauna and nature are found. And I think that that's what's needed. I I'm a little shocked with the way states have regarded Indigenous peoples. I also did a visit to Australia, and I was so shocked to hear that it was only in 1969 that they were considered human beings. Before that, they were flora and fauna. Yeah. They were part of the flora, and this is totally unacceptable in this age. So I think that really the challenge for all of us to push for peace, for nonviolence, and to clamor for the truth. Many people have their own truths, and I think that it's our job to really tell the truth in terms of what is happening to people who are very much in a situation of oppression as well as discrimination and racism. And for Indigenous peoples, that's what they are suffering from on a daily basis. But still, they want to continue their historical role of protecting what remains of our environment. And that kind of role is now recognized. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change now has a platform for sharing of indigenous knowledge and knowledge of local communities. There are now, we have lobbied the Green Climate Fund to develop an Indigenous peoples policy that protects and safeguards and does no harm. When they fund projects, they should not do any harm to Indigenous peoples. So there are all these gains we have achieved, but there is still a long way to go, especially in this time. And I think the Gandhian voice is really something that we should make more popular, along with all the UN Charter, as you have mentioned. I'm so happy that you brought copies of the UN Charter and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and hopefully we will be using this in the most effective ways to fight against big extractive industries that have been destroying indigenous lands, as well as all these other problems that they face. Finally, just to say that because of the resistance of indigenous peoples, we are also suffering from intense criminalization. The justice system is used against us to file false charges. I have made a report on criminalization and impunity against indigenous peoples. In every country, you see that indigenous peoples, if they are defending their lands, they are accused of aggravated trespassing, even if these are their lands since time immemorial. They are accused of kidnapping when they protect their lands by interrogating those who are coming in. So these are happening in a very great scale, and therefore we are launching also a campaign to stop that kind of criminalization and the impunity of displacing indigenous peoples anytime that a big political or economic figure wants to take over those lands. So the peace in the communities of indigenous peoples and justice will only happen if we really get together, protect those indigenous peoples who are in these kinds of situations, and of course unite and have a strong voice in terms of promoting nonviolence, truth, and social justice. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so just a quick thank you to Mark for inviting me. And Initiative of Change is an organisation that's been around for 80 years. And its catchphrase, if you like, is building trust across the world's divides. And we operate in 30-plus countries around the world. We focus in the UK on three main areas: trust building, business ethics, and sustainable communities. And within that, we have a practice, a way of being, which starts off, and it's very Quaker as well, it starts off with a sense of a quiet time. Connecting within, connecting to the divine, whatever phrase you are comfortable with, for that personal leading and inspiration that actually works in community as well. Out of our quiet time, we seek to accompany people in these three areas: in the trust building, in the business ethics, and in the sustainable communities. We provide training, and also we do projects. And one of the things I want to share around non-violence is to move out of the abstract into the intimate. And that's a little bit about Initiatives of Change, but I just want to kind of lift the curtain, if you like, and say what motivates me and what I find a real challenge as somebody committed to non-violence. My upbringing was anything but non-violent. I was brought up during the race riots in St. Paul's, Montpellier, in the 70s and 80s. And my earliest memory was of two West Indian lads trying to sexually assault my mother. Mm-hmm. And at a young age, at 7 or 8 years old, that does something to your psyche. That imprints something in you that I have a choice to respond to. I have this phrase, big doors swing on small hinges. The doors of opportunity for good or for ill, or as my friend would say, middling, swing on the small hinges of the personal decisions we make inside as a response to what comes up in us and how we interpret what comes towards us. I operate in a number of different contexts around politicians, people in the security services, the police, talking with extremists, whether they be on the left or the right, increasingly talking to people on the edges of white supremacism. And one thing I realize is that we don't need to be the leaders to affect change. We just need to have the ear of the leaders so they can affect change. And actually, it's about us accompanying people. And a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine in the security services, I asked him, what do you think is the biggest threat to peace? And he'd said something that, this is a number of years ago, which really resonated with me and caused me to question a number of my approaches. And his answer was the atomization or the individualization of society. In other words, people just thinking and living for themselves. He says, in an environment where people are focused purely on themselves and a quick return, when crisis comes, they are at the mercy of a compelling, even if it's wrong, voice and narrative. Because we want surety, we want assurance, we want security. And once society begins to break down and we're looking for answers, and if we've just been looking in at ourselves and we've been found wanting and lacking, because we all know that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, then those simple, non-nuanced voices speak and rally us to action. And that action can be bad when we look at history across the world. The rise of national populism and the far right across the globe at the moment is providing a simple narrative to a very complex and nuanced set of issues that we find ourselves in. So in my experience, I experienced violence. My dad was a former Special Forces soldier, and he caught these two lads in the act. Mum and Dad were running a halfway house for lads on their way to prison. We were doing something good for society because Dad wanted to pay something back. And in the middle of doing something good, we were confronted with something really bad. What's our response? Were we going to stand round and Dad was going to pray for them? No, he intervened. He intervened with measurable force. He was trained in other ways. But he had to stop it. But that had a huge impact on me. It seeded something in my psychology which created reactions in me as I went ahead in life, which made me afraid and aggressive towards people who didn't look like me. And in encountering myself non-violently, I realized that there's light, shade, variance, and darkness within who I am. So what mechanism do I or did I have to work through this issue? Because actually these issues are not just my story, they're our stories. The violence of language which we're hearing in our political discourse, the violence of seeing what's taking place around the world, we have a choice. And depending on our story, depending on the history, the philosophy, the geopolitics of people groups, business, politics, non-nuanced media narratives that are short sound bites, we as individuals have to begin to make a choice. Because all change takes place from the inside out. And I'm utterly convinced and committed about that. But we also need a groundswell where we come together and act on that impulse that surely there can be more and we can be better than this. Because on our own, it's easy to get disappointed, and sometimes together it's easy to get disappointed as we see bigger forces outside of ourselves driving events around the world where we think we're so disempowered. Is the only response left to us a violent response? I think global history suggests that there are other responses that are non-violent that can create change. But I think the challenge is how do we as individuals truly respond to the other or to the violence that we see committed against us or our people groups or the things that we really believe in? And I think out of the abstract, we have to wrestle with the fact that these are deeply personal things. How do we respond to them? I think at a very practical level, the thing that helped me, I have deep religious, a deep spiritual conviction in my heart, but it's to recognize that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. Regardless of whether we agree or disagree on the nuances of how we construct our faith and our spiritual systems, at the heart of them is a sense that that love wins, that love triumphs. And it's not some gooey, airy-fairy thing out there. It's actually deep and inside. And once I connect to that and realize that I am capable of the very things that I find repulsive in the actions and the activities of those other people around me, that does something. Because growing up, I wanted to hurt those people that hurt my mum. I didn't voice it like that, but I just had a disposition within me. And that needed breaking. Because whether I like it or not, that dark, that shadow within me will begin to impact me and my decision making. And should I get into power, my policies, my lobbying, my influence. And I think as we think about the Gandhian voice, I had the privilege a couple of months ago of we hosted Rajmohan and Usha. And I spent a good amount of time introducing Rajmohan to a number of different people, traveling around with him. And as we were talking, I said, some of these things are intellectually simple. You just don't do certain things. You don't sell certain items. You don't engage in those kinds of treaties. You don't respond in that way. But I fundamentally understood that it may be intellectually simple, but it's emotionally hard. Because my story is your story. Our story is what we see around the world. And whatever name we put to a politician or a policymaker or a business leader or whatever, ultimately they're individuals that will make decisions that collectively will create change. I'm convinced that the path of non-violence doesn't start out there, it starts in here. And it starts with a personal practice and a commitment that we're not atomized, as my friend from the security services said. We're not atomized, we're deeply connected. But we need to start looking within before we start doing stuff without. And actually they tend to happen at the same time. And in our work at Initiatives of Change, we have a real belief that these changes take place through this intimate connection internally, but then doing that in community as well. And it flushes itself out into practical work. And I think in a world of extremism, why don't we become extremely generous? I don't want extremism to be hijacked for the negative. I want to be known, don't you want to be known as extremely forgiving, extremely generous, extremely welcoming, extremely nuanced, yeah? And I think that we have a great opportunity, because it is so difficult, to actually have a life that's committed to being extremely non-violent. Extremely committed to walking that very challenging path. I mean, I could go on for ages, as you're aware. But there's beyond the strategies and the tactics, and we can be well versed in those, there's this sense that actually it starts from within, because when we realize that we're capable of the very things that we find repulsive and repugnant, we then start from a different place. We start in humility and openness. And I would just encourage all of us as we dialogue through the day and share lunch and coffee and tea and those wonderful naughty snacks at the back, that we actually create the collaborations that are necessary, because no one person and no one organisation is going to do it. It's going to take all of us working together to create a better world. Yep.
So we have had 3 wonderful presentations. Of course, Bruce's main lecture, followed by 2 sets of comments. So who would like to ask questions from the audience? It was easy to clap, and I'm sure it's just as easy to translate it into comments. Yes, please.
all four on the stage. I had the opportunity of meeting a young Tibetan girl in India last year, who is, part of a very large displaced community living, across India, and they're leading, helping themselves to really fight against all odds, and taking in, some of the things that Victoria had just mentioned. And, they're really doing a marvelous job. And so, is there opportunity of doing what Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan did against all odds, creating 100,000 army of non-violent? And, that's a really unknown story. I mean, it's known sort of, among small circles. But perhaps, that is the level of commitment and, the movement that is required now. And I've been fortunate of attending Lord Parek's events in House of Lords, the awarding of prizes. And one of them, about a few years ago, a young girl in her early 20s, made a point of, when are the younger generation, going to be brought in? Perhaps, like the young girl in New York, who's made such a splash, across the world. So perhaps, yes, I think it's, it's time to, bring in these young generations, and really, provide good backing for them. So, it's just not a question, but perhaps, is it something you agree with?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that comment. Indeed, I totally agree with that, with your idea that we really need to bring in the younger generation, because at the end of the day, it's their future that we are all concerned about. And as a grandmother, I have 8 grandchildren. I'm very much concerned about what future it is that they will see. If we don't do what is necessary for them to have a better society when they grow, when they grow up. And I think, one of the things that I have seen in my work as a rapporteur, I've been to many indigenous communities in Latin America. I've been in the Pacific, and I'm going to Congo Brazzaville next month. One of the things that I've seen that has really long-lasting effects is really when indigenous peoples sort of take on the responsibility of asserting their right to be self-determining, the right to determine what their economic, social, and cultural development is about, and to assert this. And in many communities, I've seen indigenous communities who have asserted that they would like to become autonomous. In Mexico in particular, I visited Mexico. I went to a community where the indigenous women, in fact, were the ones who led a process of fighting against the logging concessions that were deforesting their forests. And this was led by a drug cartel. So the women themselves mobilized, they barricaded the logging trucks, and then after that, the men joined them. And they went to the municipality and kicked out all the political officials and the government employees. They said, you were colluding with the drug cartels, and this is where we find ourselves in. And they elected their own officials, they set up their own governance. The government challenged them in the Supreme Court and the Electoral Tribunal, but in the end they won. And now there are many communities like that. And I asked the government, the Mexican government, I said, is it true that these people who have asserted autonomy, they have better indicators of peace, of well-being, of security? And the government said, actually, it's true. So now we are just allowing them to do that because they did much better than we have done. And so I think that's one really strong movement that I've seen in many parts of the world. And if governments stop harassing and doing impunity against these people, then maybe we will have communities of peace and security and non-violence. But it required that amount of bravery, to fight against the drug cartels, because the women were just so fed up. Their children are being recruited by the drug cartels to become drug mules. In the end, they will be killed. And they said, enough of this already. And that's why, what your point about people taking it upon themselves, really risking their lives to do it, is something that really needs to be supported strongly, especially when they are repressed and harassed by the government.
Thank you. Yes, please. The lady over there.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the saying, if I could call it that, that for evil to exist, it's enough that good people do nothing. And I'm just wondering whether our energy is better focused on, if you like, the people at political level, or whether the world would change more quickly if our focus was on the good people who are doing nothing. And in that case, what would we be doing after today to try to engage more people?
I think if you've got any energy, I don't mind where you use it. The important thing is to use it. But look, most people don't use it at all. You can't do everything. You can only concentrate on one or two things. One organisation, or you can work with C&D or campaign against the arms trade or United Nations Association. Don't try and do everything. But I think most of all, we are so busy thinking of great schemes to change the world, we're actually forgetting that the people next door haven't got a clue what we're doing or why. And so we're not approaching the local schools, we're not talking to the local libraries, we're not going around to the local churches and synagogues, we're not actually using the things we could do immediately without any great fuss or bother, and nobody's going to arrest you for sticking up a notice somewhere. So I think the local push. There used to be an excellent organisation which an inspired person started about 1985, I think, called the Press Gang. Anybody ever heard of the Press Gang? Nobody's heard of the Press Gang. It was quite simple. A press gang was a group of people who circulated information amongst each other about how to write a letter to the local paper about an issue. And it sounds incredibly stupid, but actually it needs a little bit of skill and a little bit of focus on an issue. Where I come from, the local papers always got something about terrible things happening to the Whittington Hospital. And it's in the paper. Hardly ever in the letters is there any connection between the economic problems of Whittington Hospital and that we're spending £200 billion on more nuclear weapons. You're not going to go to prison for writing a letter like that or getting it in, but it's a kind of discipline of persistence that actually brings these things out. And I think that sometimes we're so busy with the far horizon and changing the Johnsons and the Corbyns and God knows what else, that we're actually forgetting what happens in our own locality. But don't be despondent. You can't do everything. Just do something that actually works and move on from there.
Yes, please.
I mean, in terms of practical next steps, I have to think practically because I think of end games and tactics and all that kind of stuff. I think two things. I think number one, we all have a circumstance we live in, and circumstance is the circle you stand in. That's how I understand it. So I look at the circle I stand in, and I stand in different circles in different places. So in my job, I have a title, a role, I have access. Now, I can either use that as currency for myself and my ego, or I can use any position that I have as currency. In other words, I spend that on behalf of something and somebody else bigger and outside of myself. So I think in any circumstance I'm in, if I'm with my neighbour, then my deep values and my spirituality will inform the kind of conversations that we have about matters and issues, and then how we engage practically and locally. If I'm in my more formal role and I have access to different people, then that's the circle I'm standing in, and I'm asking myself, how can I spend what I have on something bigger and outside of myself? So it might mean community activism on the ground, it might be, the word is horrible, the phrase, but lobbying, political lobbying at another level. And I think I'll finish with this, connected to the atomization thought. I think that has bred in us a very short-term mentality. Many of the spiritual traditions would picture God, certainly Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic faiths, and beyond that as well, as a generational God. And I think sometimes we think very short-term, when if we're thinking strategically, we need to be building for the generations to come. And I think that causes us to ask some questions of ourselves. I'm white and I'm a man. I'm male and pale and I'm halfway to 90, okay? The only diversity thing I've got is the fact I'm working class stock. But of course, look at this, I'm not now, am I? I've got to realise that as an individual in the circle I stand in, that I have inherent unknown biases. So that means if I want to seed something for the future, I need to, this is my personal narrative, I need to disproportionately focus on black and ethnic minorities and women. Because what happens is we start to see change, and it's still the white blokes who sit at the top of it in a Western democracy. And that has to change, because I cannot possibly understand what it's like to really the felt need of the other. So I think circumstantially, there's the local expression with a neighbour, there's also the bigger play, but also thinking tactically, who can I specifically accompany to inspire them to be an agent of change who looks, sounds and feels different to me, I think.
Can I say something?
We have time for just one last question, absolutely the last.
Yes, I'd like to pose an issue for you to consider, and that is that we live to natural values that are common to all cultures, all people. And you spoke before about having exceeding compassion and, well, the competitive environment in the world we're in, too often the values that people believe are going to make them happy, and everyone wants to be happy. Anyone in this room not want to be happy? Oh, all right. In today's world, all too often, it's wealth, power, fame, and pleasure. By the way, these were the same at the end of the Roman Empire. Now, in this competitive environment, the focus is on me. And as you've suggested, it should be we. And that means compassion, respect, but also other common values like honesty. Now, a question you might put to people is, what does it feel like when you consciously tell a lie? It's uncomfortable because it's unnatural. The values are all natural and can be accessed by everyone regarding age, race, creed, whatever. And that seems to be the direction we should be pointing people towards. A thought.
One of you is welcome to comment. Because if, yes.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, all these values are values that I think genetically we have this. We are brought up by our parents to these values, and I think that at least for Indigenous peoples, we are very strong in propagating these values of reciprocity, of compassion, of solidarity, and as a community, it's not just for yourself. So all the reach of our spirituality is very much steeped in these values, and I think that I believe most people would have those values. The thing is, when they are found in a context where they have to become capitalists, they have to earn profit, they have to do, to cheat so that to be able to earn more profits, then those values go down the drain. And I think that that's what we need to do, keep reminding people that these are the natural values. There's such a thing as natural justice, and we should be scared about not following this, because in the end we will just find ourselves in the whole society in a very bad shape. And I think that that's the message that we need to express, and maybe that's where the Gandhian philosophy comes in, because all of these values are contained in his thinking, in his teaching. So as well as, of course, all the other great teachers. And I think that maybe that's the task that we have. How do we make these values, become internalized by everybody and practiced by everybody? And that's the way that change is going to come about.
Well, I think on that note, must you ask the question, or will you? I saw a hand go up. John, I think we have to bring the meeting to a close by 5 to 12.
Yeah.
But yes, you can put a question.
Actually, it's not a question, it's just a comment to Maria. Victoria, sorry. I've seen myself the aggression towards indigenous people. I worked in the Amazon and I participated in UN conference in Cusco. I don't know if you've been part as well, global conference on indigenous people, giving them a voice. And the problem, the crisis they were facing globally from in the industry and etc. At the same time, there's a message coming through, I think, from the indigenous people, more and more people are aware of it, because they have never lost the love and respect for nature, which we have, the attunement with nature. And as climate change is moving forward and we know what's happening, I think more and more people realize maybe we should listen to them more. And I think certainly there's certain movement, I feel, that is happening. So just a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
You want to say something, Bruce? You have the last.
Just say that I'm responding to you because you've got such a very elastic face. I was watching as I was talking. You were responding, and I thought that's wonderful. Somebody's out hearing what I'm saying. I'm going to go. So that's why I'm coming in now, because I'm responding to your response.
Stop flattering.
But I'm not sure I'm answering you. What I'm saying in my general line is that I'm not at the big world at the top of big ideas. I'm talking about mostly what is immediately possible here and now for us to do. We don't have to be theorizing. We have now. Someone's trying to interrupt me. I don't know why. I haven't finished yet because it's in the coffee machine later on. We have at the moment. What's the issue at the moment? It's climate change, isn't it? But what are the issues of climate change? Who's campaigning about the 10% of CO2 globally, which comes from the military? Who's making that connection? Or you come along, look on the M4, jammed with cars in all directions. Who's talking about automatic ownership of cars with indefinite numbers? These are the issues that need to be taken up. So I'm all for the big theory, but I think what our challenge to all of us is what are we picking up specifically to change the situation that we're in. But anyway, thank you for your nice mobile face.
Okay.
Now you can see that the Bruce Kent is not only an excellent thinker and speaker, but also a charmer. And even at this age, not to forget how to exercise the charm is quite an achievement. Anyway, we should bring the meeting to a close.
Thank you.
Just want to leave one thought with the panel. We have been talking about non-violent form of protest. Now let's look at the basis of that assumption. Think of people who are deprived and who are fighting for justice, or indigenous people fighting for their rights. They have a choice. They can either use a violent method or a non-violent method. Violent method in certain circumstances might be quicker. Kill a boss, end of story, the guy will panic and do what you want to do. Why must you stick to non-violence? Why should the victim carry the burden of suffering? I hope you see the problem. Very intrinsic to Gandhi. And when I do some summing up, I would like to say something about how Gandhi could never resolve the problem. Because when you talk about non-violence, the first choice is, supposing by simply knocking off my head or putting a bomb, I cause panic and I'm able to get what I want, that's morally the cheapest, the easiest way of doing things. Why not do that? Instead of like Gandhi, thousands of people marching, hit me if you want to, satyagraha, hit me if you want to, but I shall not give in. What is the point of that bravado? And that bravado is simply limited to the victims. Why should the victims be the sufferer all the time? Now that was a question put to him by some very serious people. And Gandhi said, look, you go for non-violence because it is intrinsically superior. Why is it intrinsically superior? Who decides it? You say, well, it says life is sacred. Yes, but if life is sacred, not only I should not kill, but the other guy should not put me in a position of having to do this kind of thing. If life is sacred, then that man, my tormentor, is just as guilty as I am. So that doesn't apply just to me. So life is sacred doesn't help very much. Why then stick to non-violence? Then Gandhi increasingly turned to the pragmatic argument that, look, violence never ultimately succeeds because it always creates a spiral of violence. But what if it doesn't? Why must you start with the assumption that violence always does this? And Gandhi's view of saying non-violence means, reconciliation, end of story and so on. But what if the other guy is not prepared to listen? So the pragmatic ground that violence never fails is not true, because throughout history, violence has had mixed results. Sometimes it has succeeded, sometimes it hasn't. We all wish that Hitler had been killed. If Hitler's assassins had succeeded, would we not have said wonderful thing? Thank God they succeeded. The enormous tyranny that he imposed would have come to an end. The extermination camp where millions died would have stopped. What was Gandhi's answer to the Jews in extermination camps? Non-violence? It wouldn't work. So I think the ultimate question at the end of the day, from a Gandhian perspective, one of the questions is, why must non-violence be a moral preference? Just as for the Catholics, poverty, Christian poverty, is supposed to be a moral preference, so that the Pope on Easter Day washes the poor man's feet. The question for a Gandhian is, why should non-violence be a moral preference? Anyway, on those few words, I stop. Thank you all for absolutely wonderful presentations, and thanks particularly to Bruce for his excellent talk. Thank you.
Good morning. We're having a lovely privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've got a question for the audience, actually, just before we start. Would you rather be a unicorn or a zebra? Would you rather be a unicorn or a zebra? Zebra. Now that question is one facing a lot of new emerging companies, particularly in the tech field. And a unicorn is a business which is very fast growing, which reaches $1 billion. And apparently now there are a number of unicorns and other emerging businesses who think they would rather be a zebra. And a zebra is a business that is powered towards profit and purpose, hence the black and white stripes. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? And on the other end of the scale of all these new emerging organisations, companies and industries, at the other end we've had an example this week of Thomas Cook, the loss of a company, 170 years old. It's going to cost millions in reparation, the damage that's done. And basically, it's a company that is a 20th century company that's just not geared up for the 21st century. So what does it mean to be geared up for the 21st century? What would Gandhi think about what we're doing with our businesses and our economic systems? Is there hope of good companies emerging and doing good in the world? Interesting. I just want to show you this. This is the conversation I've been around for a long time is conscious capitalism, good capitalism. There's many words to describe it where companies have motives other than just pure profit. And in the life and art section, not the business section of the Financial Times, there's an article called Capitalism, A New Dawn, and that's just in the last 2 weeks. So there are big changes afoot, and that's why I think it's great that we've got Andrew Sims with us this morning, who you've seen from the bio of the books he's written. And it seems to me, Andrew, you have a unique way of making these very complex issues understandable. I love the idea of the Earth Overshoot Day. That's a great way of bringing down, a climate issue down to an economic algorithm we can understand. There's a day when something changes. And so you've written these books. I really enjoyed your book on Tescopoly. Shocked to find out how much money was going into one organisation, the effect it was doing. So you're writing in these books and studying, and the New Weather Institute. I mean, are we out for a sunny outlook with a few showers, or is it rainy with a bit of sunshine? What is the prognosis for how business and commerce is going?
I think I can confidently say that the prognosis is that the weather will be highly changeable in economic and every other sense. And it's incredibly nice of you to invite me here. It's my first visit to Global Cooperation House, a beautifully named building. We're going to need an awful lot of it. And by bizarre coincidence, when I've finished here today, I'm dashing off back into town to conduct a seminar on the business of rapid transition, which speaks very specifically to the theme of today. I've always had a problem with the word capitalism, because I think the problem is in the name. As soon as you give an overweening privilege to one particular aspect of the economy, you are going to have problems. So I have a problem with the very idea of a system in which capital, money itself, is privileged over everything else, over nature, over people, over community. And I've long argued that it is almost fundamentally unsustainable, and we need to find new ways of doing things. Obviously, this is not a new insight. I should say that the work we're doing to try and reimagine the economy and do it at the speed and scale that the environment tells us that we need to, that the science of climate change, for example, tells us that we need to, is to create a new international alliance called the Rapid Transition Alliance. For those of you who like going online to find your information, you can have a look at rapidtransition.org, where there's lots of case studies of change happening in the economy, in communities, all around the world at the speed and scale required. Obviously, as we sit here today, things are happening all around us. There will be people gathering in Trafalgar Square in respect of the need for action on climate change following the global school strikes last week, and in advance of the next wave of actions by Extinction Rebellion. This afternoon, the arts sector is meeting in Trafalgar Square to demonstrate and talk about the need for cultural change as well as business change. Obviously, the two overlap. But I thought, because we're here marking the 150th anniversary of Gandhi himself, I thought it was, I stumbled across some words of Gandhi's which seemed to have increased their meaning in the current context. And I speak of when he said that I do not want my house to be walled in or my windows blocked. I want the cultures of all lands to be blown about the house as freely as possible. But I also refuse to be blown off my feet. And I think this is part of the challenge that we face, both in terms of the social and political upheavals around us, but also in terms of climate breakdown. And of course, Gandhi also famously observed that it took Britain half the resources of this planet to achieve its level of prosperity. And then he posed the question, how many planets will India require for its development? And of course, we know, as you mentioned, with the Earth Overshoot Day that we calculated, that we are living fundamentally beyond our means. This year, the day that the world started to live beyond its environmental means, fell the earliest it ever has, ever since it went into the negative in the late 1970s. This year, on July the 29th, we started consuming more materials and producing more waste than the biosphere can replace and absorb safely. So we have this epic challenge. And yet, one of our greatest problems is that, and this has been said so many times now that nobody's quite sure who said it first, and it's so resonant, I've seen it attributed to about at least 6 different people, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is a fundamental change to our economic system. So here is our challenge. How can we reimagine the economy? Now, I'm shocked at the way that some of the very forces that led to things like the financial collapse of 2007, 2008, have used the failure of their own system to almost more deeply entrench their way of doing things. So much so that in 2011, years after the crash, the Wall Street Journal felt able to publish a book which was called The Wall Street Journal Guide to Investing in the Apocalypse. And it wasn't ironic. They were genuinely looking at investment opportunities from collapse. So here's our challenge. We know from the consensus of the climate science that the changes required are rapid, far-reaching, and in all aspects of our lives. And furthermore, they have to start now and be compressed into at least the next 10 years for a radical change in how we do it. And I kind of sat there and asked myself, can we even imagine changes like that happening? And something came to me when I asked myself that question. I live in South London, my first time in Dollis Hill. Hello, Dollis Hill. And I live under the flight paths that lead into Heathrow. And on a morning, back in 2010, in April, when I woke up, something was different. The normal sounds that I hear in the sky above me were not there. I turned on the radio, and I found out that due to a volcano erupting in a far-off place, a volcano with an almost unpronounceable name, thank you, that the aviation industry had been switched off like a switch going overnight. And for several days, no planes took to the air. One of the fundamental arteries of the modern global economy was no longer available to us. So did the sky fall on our heads? Well, no, it didn't, because what happened next I found absolutely revelatory. First of all, in terms of people who were stranded, they turned to social media. They car shared, they sofa surfed. Other transport industries put on spare capacity. Business people who were meant to be flying to appointments turned to video conferencing. The supermarkets who would normally have flown in their luxury horticultural produce from West Africa or Asia turned to local suppliers to replace it. Jens Stoltenberg, who was the Norwegian Prime Minister, was stranded at the UN in New York at the time. He ran his parliament from his iPad. So something we thought we couldn't live without, suddenly overnight we discovered that we could live without. So if you want to get a sense of how we might adapt or how resilient the slack in our systems, just think of things like that. And transport's another interesting one, because now we look at the train as being potentially the new environmental saviour in terms of how we get about. But goodness me, don't we have difficulty upgrading lines and mending lines that don't run terribly well? But think back to the middle of the 19th century, and in a period of just 7 years in Britain, we laid over 4,400 miles of new railway track, introducing a new infrastructure. So when we think about the challenge of new low-carbon infrastructures for our economy, let's remember some of the boldness and ambition that we've experienced in the past. So what kind of economy do we need? Well, one of my favorite ecological economists is a man called Herman Daly. And he makes the point about that we cannot simply, obviously, continue growing anymore, and that the notion that we can save what he calls the growth forever paradigm by simply dematerializing the economy or decoupling it from resources or substituting information for resources is a fantasy. He says we can surely eat lower down the food chain, but we cannot eat recipes. So his idea for what a different economy looks like, he calls for a subtle and complex economics of maintenance, of qualitative improvements, of sharing, frugality, and adaptation to natural limits. He says that this is an economics of better, not bigger. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, I just thought it's worth thinking of a few examples. We have posed the question about different ownership models, for example, about how we do things in the economy, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. But just, for example, in terms of things changing quickly, water is obviously the stuff of life. It is also, the water cycle is one of the things most vulnerable to climate breakdown and the climate emergency. Well, from there being just 2 examples back in the year 2000 of water services being remunicipalized, taken back into the public sphere and out of the private profit motive. In 2015, there were 235 instances of that. What else does this look like? We had the first repair cafe for the circular economy in 2009. There's over 1,700 repair cafes now. We had the first instance of divestment from fossil fuels in 2012. The 1,000th example of investors divesting from fossil fuels came in 2018, and we're seeing ever larger investors getting out of fossil fuels. The Transition Town Network, which is all about moving to a deep sustainability model at the local level, well, that only got going in the year 2006, and now there's between 2,000 and 3,000 transition towns in over 50 countries. Suddenly, after David Attenborough's film about plastic pollution in our oceans, the idea of single-use plastics, which were once almost kind of taken for granted, became no longer acceptable. That changed almost overnight. And in terms of the food that we eat, I was offered a vegan option for my cup of tea when I came in here. The vegans have been around for ages. In Britain, to be honest, they've been the butt of quite a few jokes, but I think we can genuinely say that the vegans have now landed ever since Greggs the Baker's introduced its vegan sausage roll. And the growth rate of that change in diet has been exponential in the last few years. Rapid change is possible. Now, Greta Thunberg, the wonderful young Swedish student who was so committed to her ideals that she took a boat to get to America, and when she came to Britain earlier in this year to speak in the British Parliament that had not debated climate change for 3 years at that point, she took the train, very conspicuously took the train, and this was widely reported in the Swedish press. As a consequence of that, in just 4 months, the number of people taking flights from Sweden went down 8%. The number of people taking the train instead as an environmentally friendly alternative went up 8%. So I think my message is that in the face of this epochal challenge that we face, we ask the question, is change possible at the speed and scale that the science determines? Well, yes, I think it is. But it's not just going to happen. It matters that we all play a role, that we get involved in the growing calls for rapid change, that we talk about it with our friends and our family and in our workplaces, so that that dynamic social contagion effect of social change and behavior change takes root. And I thought I'd just kind of finish with a quote from one of my favorite writers, a woman called Rebecca Solnit, who our theme today is very much to do with hope, and she wrote a book called Hope in the Dark, which I recommend to everybody. And she said this, she said, hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. It is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. To hope, she says, is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. Thank you.
So, Andrew, talking about the effect that we're having on the climate, on the planet, and you know, the wonderful things that have been happening just in the last few years. In the shift in commerce of business, one of the key principles of Gandhi was egalitarian business and equality. And one of the things that we do see is this massive gap between what some people earn and what a lot of people earn. And it used to be, you know, a figure of times 40. Wow, that's a lot for the CEO or that level to earn compared to the median of lower levels. And now it's like 300, 400, 500. You probably have better figures than me, but it's hugely unequal. And if we're looking for new solutions to have business that has stronger positive values, that's doing more good in the world, perhaps we need to look at how they're structured. And Graham Nuttall it's been your passion, hasn't it, to look at alternatives for ownership and pioneered employee ownership with the report that you did. Why don't you tell us some of the possibilities of having a new kind of business with a different role for the employees?
Yes, I'd be delighted to talk about that. I sort of start from being both a lawyer and a tax advisor, which is probably not the greatest introduction to speaking about new economic models. But throughout my career, well, it dawned on me fairly early on that really what you needed to do was create the right business model for a particular business. And if it wasn't there, invent it, create it. I was actually struck about your comment, Andrew, on a rapid transition and how this contrasted with something that Guy Watson said to me last week when I visited his organic farm, or rather I should say the organic farm now majority owned by his employees. He has an outspoken criticism of climate change, inaction in respect of climate change, of capitalism and the excesses of capitalism. But the delightful phrase he came up with is, there's a limit to what we do. And here at Riverford Organics, we are changing the world one vegetable box at a time, which showed a practical approach. And what I want to do is, again, offer you some hope by talking about one particular economic model that I believe has an amazing ability to meet with many of the aims of the Gandhi Foundation and many of the things that we would like to see in a modern economic model. And I'm talking about the Employee Ownership Trust Controlled Company, EOT, and perhaps by way of a bit of background, a bit of context, there is a business model inspired by Gandhi's vision of trusteeship in industry and Quaker values, and that's the Scott Barder Commonwealth, which was awarded the Gandhi Foundation Peace Prize back in 2014. And Ernst Barder wanted to create an alternative form of wealth creation to the traditional joint stock company. And in summary, he established an employee-owned charity as the parent of a trading company, a trading group, the Scott Barder Group. And if one looks back in the years before 2014 in the employee ownership sector, you'll find a number of pioneers who each created their own economic model to achieve their particular aims. In modern times, there is a tremendous character called Hugh Facey. He is a force of nature. He founded a manufacturing company called Griffel, which makes connectors for wire fences, and a marvellous invention, and Griffel have lots of other innovative inventions. An important part of the Griffel structure is an organisation called Glide, which is a not-for-profit company that owns shares in Griffel alongside employees, and it exists as a voice to ensure that the employee ownership ethos continues in the long term. We go back a bit further, we got Swan Morton, surgical blade manufacturer, again in Sheffield, and Arrow, the engineering and design company. These are longer established employee-owned companies, and both of these companies' structures involve a charity working alongside an employee trust. Again, the employee trust operates to ensure that the employee ownership structure continues for the long term. And even longer established, of course, is the John Lewis Partnership, 100% owned by an employee trust established in 1929. Now, the common theme in all these structures is custodianship or trusteeship. These pioneers of employee ownership invariably incorporate some form of trust or its equivalent as a permanent feature in the ownership structure to nurture the employee ownership culture. Thankfully, since 2014, we now have a default model for that sort of trust, the Employee Ownership Trust, or EOT. The EOT was introduced in the Finance Act 2014, following the findings of my 2012 review of employee ownership for the coalition government. This was as part of the coalition government's drive to see more employee ownership in private companies. there are capital gains tax and income tax exemptions to encourage the creation of EOTs with controlling interests in companies. And there's been a period of sustained growth of this business model. There are now some 400 employee-owned companies in this country, and over 60% of these employee-owned companies have come into existence since 2014, since the creation of the EOT. There is a business model there that is working, and people are rushing to use it. Among architects, for example, the EOT is now a mainstream business model. I think over 20% of the top 100 architects firms in this country are now owned by their employees through an EOT. And the move of the fourth largest architects practice in this country, AHMM, to employee ownership in 2017 acted as a particular catalyst. And indeed, number 3 is also thinking about a move to employee ownership. So this is a mainstream business model in relation to architects. It needs to be better known. There needs to be more publicity for it. It's working, but I hold it out as a positive sign that it is possible within our existing sort of legal and tax system to create better business models. And I thought I'd test the EOT against the Gandhi Foundation's aims, and it's an excellent match. An EOT provides a harmonious way of transferring ownership from typically a small number of founders of a company to all its employees. The employee bonuses that are typical of EOT-owned companies help reduce income inequality. Instead of a few owners taking home healthy dividends, there are surpluses available to pay out to all staff as bonuses. An EOT-owned company emphasizes self-reliance, cooperation, and, of course, trusteeship. Each employee is made aware of their responsibilities as well as their rights as employees and beneficiaries. And the trustee of the EOT has to act in the best interests of all employees in the long term. Each EOT-owned company typically is a decentralized business that involves the active participation of every employee. And research that I helped conduct into the moral DNA of employee-owned companies showed significantly higher scores in the values of fairness, trust, excellence, humility, and courage. Indeed, with no significant differences between seniority levels. Employees throughout the business, exerted or showed those characteristics. It's great if you can work somewhere, you can be your true self, rather than put on your work face and abandon all the usual behaviours, the good behaviours you have at home. A report by a large number of business bodies, resulting in the ownership dividend report, found that a majority of employee-owned businesses make explicit commitments to contribute directly to their local communities. So we can see the employee-owned trust company as obviously being good for staff, for their well-being. It is good for profitability. These are businesses that are good businesses, but the surpluses are there to invest as the employees think appropriate, and that often means the local communities. And so the local communities, regions benefit. EOTs are good for the economy as a whole. So in response to those who are calling for adapting or reinventing capitalism for a modern economy, and especially when that call is for some form of reinvention of the cooperative or worker cooperation, I hold out the EOT as a starting point. Have a look at it. I think it will answer a lot of the questions that we are asking of the company and what it should be for the future.
Is it something something that's suitable for all businesses, no matter their size, or are there certain types of businesses that it's better to have, or is it something that's universal?
Yeah, my mantra is that it works for all sizes of companies in all sectors at whatever stage of their development. But there are limitations. If you are setting up a fast-growing company that will eat a lot of share capital as it establishes a brand and a market, then one has to say that could be a rocky ride for the employees, and maybe it's better to wait for the business to settle down a bit before staff take their stake and then steer that business forward. So there are limits.
It's a timing issue in that respect. So.
I would say it's a timing issue, yes.
Very good. Excellent. Okay. So what questions might we have for either of our speakers? Yes, microphone's coming. Okay,
Yes, you might be interested to know that I invited Vince Cable to give the Gandhi Foundation annual lecture a few years back, and I suggested the title to him, What Would a Gandhian Business Model Look Like? He was Minister of whatever it was called then, and what would a Lib Dem government, what steps would a Lib Dem government take to achieve this? Well, you can predict. He answered the first very competently. He knows his Gandhi, theology, but he didn't answer the second part. I want to step up a little and look at the nature of capitalism, another word with ism on the end. It's a belief system. So we have neo-bourgeois capitalism dominating our world, with concentration of power escalating into the hands of fewer and fewer people. Yuval Noah Harari, it explains that the three aims of this belief system: bliss, longevity, and divinity, by which he means divinity is power over your life, bliss, you don't have to do any work, and longevity, you will live forever. These are the kind of subliminal aims of every product and service that the large companies, Apple and all the rest of it, are providing. Now we have Shoshana Zuboff talking about surveillance capitalism. That is that each one of us, they know where we are. They know more about us than we know about ourselves. So in the face of this appalling catastrophe of concentration of power, I love what you're doing, but surely it's only a very small beginning and is not having any effect on this planet-wide belief system.
This is where I come back to: you can only change the world one vegetable box at a time. I'm doing what I can. There are, instead of 100 owners benefiting from owning companies, there are now tens of thousands of employees benefiting. We see a similar sort of scale in America, where you look at there is research into the financial well-being of employees in employee-owned companies, and they are significantly better off than their peers because of this business model. There is a movement to scale up, and there is still, notwithstanding the fact that Riverford Organics, Richer Sounds, Lush, Aardman, Animation have all moved to employee ownership, we still need to shout about it to get it heard. But I think once it is heard, it's reinventing capitalism almost by the back door. People don't realise they're doing it. There are baby boomer owners of businesses who say, well, that sounds a neat idea. I quite like selling to my staff. But we'll look around in 10 years' time, and suddenly we've got a lot of very wealthy employees, nurturing businesses they care about, and because employees, do look at where they work, at how the priorities of the business, we'll find, I think, that they are more sustainable, they are more caring about the climate. Whether it's fast enough, whether it's a big enough scale, all I can say is I'm doing my bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. This is such an important part of the whole equation. My name is Lindsay. I'm a Quaker, so thank you for the Scott Bader comment. In envisaging an evolving new economic paradigm, I have two things that I want to know if you think this would be valuable in the equation. The first is when we calculate cost, if it becomes imperative that we calculate environmental cost in the concept of cost. And the other thing is for limited liabilities companies, what if we took out the concept of limited so that companies were accountable for their actions? Thank you.
Interesting.
Two quick things on that. There's been focused on one or two very particular sectors in the economy. There has been a campaign for some years to look at strict liability. The debate around the introduction of genetic modification in the food chain brought a big call for the introduction of strict liability, because then you would be sure that the companies advocating a new novel technique would have to be very, very, very careful and very, very sure of what they were doing. I've forgotten what was the first half of your question again. Costing, yes, of course. And I think it's been a kind of a touchstone of environmental and ecological economics that one should go for full cost accounting. One should try and understand and apply the full costs of things in order for kind of conventional economic mechanisms to work. But then, once again, there are also limits to that, in the sense that if you were to rely purely upon a full internalization of environmental damage costs into your economic model, you might still face the kind of bizarre problem where you have particularly wealthy societies, they might still be prepared to pay what it costs in order to continue polluting. So there is a balance between using the conventional economic toolkit of the price mechanism and full internalization of costs, and actually understanding quantitative limits. The quantitative limits of the burden that we put on our ecosystems and the biosphere. That's to say that if you used a fancy little bit of environmental cost accounting and were able to work out that the ton of carbon, which when burnt would tip you over into irreversible climate change, cost $3 trillion or whatever, and somebody popped up and said, well, yeah, I'm prepared to pay that, you would have a problem. The system would fail. You have to have a system in which we have to live within the planetary boundaries as we understand them, and the sophistication of being able to identify those boundaries, whether it's to do with the nitrate cycle for agriculture, whether it's to do with species loss, whether it's to do with climate change, which we understand much better now, is getting much more advanced. So I think, yes, we need to use the full economic toolkit, but we also need to understand the importance of quantitative limits. And in a sense, in climate change, since the international targets for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees have come into place, that's given us a carbon budget to live within, one that we are burning through incredibly rapidly if we're to have any certainty of staying within it, and we'll burn through it within the next decade without change. So yes, use all the tools, but also be aware that that's not a guarantee of avoiding ecological collapse.
So it's a beautiful sunny day, we should turn the lights out.
I wouldn't disagree.
Got the window open.
I mean, if I could add to that, what is interesting in employee-owned companies where you have no external shareholders, particularly after you've bought out the founders, it's really for that group of owners, the employees, to decide how they share the profit. And quite often you will see them saying, we're quite happy to have a lower profit if that means building a product that is more expensive but more sustainable, or indeed we'd prefer to spend some money supporting local charities. And so it's not cost accounting in the way you've described it, but it is taking it into account in practice, because you do not have the pressure of a stock exchange telling you to increase your dividend each quarter. And it's just on the question of limited liability, I would say for employees it's actually important to retain the limited liability so that you can present a safe proposition to staff. They take enough risks in their life without saying, oh, by the way, the business goes bust, all the creditors will be chasing after you. And ironically, this is the reason why so many architects are moving to employee ownership, because they all incorporated to limit liability. And once you incorporate, you have owners, and they're all retiring, and they're wondering what to do with their shares. And that is really what's creating the supply of these new employee-owned companies. So, yes, I think we can keep to limited liability for the time being.
I'd also add, actually, that going back into economic history is our friend in this case, because limited liability, and in fact that the original corporate form, the gifts that were given in terms of the kind of the get out that limited liability was created for, was on the understanding that what companies were doing brought public benefit. It was the quid pro quo of how you were incorporated as a company. So where you have companies whose only purpose is the maximization of profits and returns to shareholders, one could argue that under those circumstances you'd be within your rights to revisit limited liability. But where you have companies that are set up much more for broader public benefit and the benefit of the employees, yes, there is an argument that they should retain the protection.
Indeed, wasn't it Quaker entrepreneurs setting up local stock exchanges that helped create, the original joint stock company?
In new business model, is there a provision to make things we need, not we want, that might solve the climate disaster? At the moment, fashion industries, and if you look at car and digital world, it's all things we want, not need.
Pushed by consumerism.
If I go back to my mantra that employee ownership works in all sorts of businesses, I would say that there is a natural restraint in terms of what businesses do that comes from having all your employees involved, because they do take into account a wider range of issues. And there is a tendency, for employee-owned companies to be producing, nice things like tip-tree jam or organic vegetables. But in my vision, it could still be a company that produces. Produces things that aren't necessary, but hopefully it'll be producing it in a bit more sustainable way than competitors.
I'd just add that there is a bill that has just been introduced, that is before Parliament now. It's introduced by the Green MP Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis of the Labour Party. He's the shadow frontbench Treasury spokesperson on climate change. It's the Green New Deal Bill. It's actually got a more fancy name because the clerk's office wouldn't let us call it the Green New Deal Bill. It's called something like the Decarbonisation Bill. And it includes multiple provisions to encourage the emergence of those bits of the green economy where we will be producing the things that we need, like energy efficient homes, the low carbon transition of the economy more broadly, so that there will be huge encouragement and a much easier access to funds for those bits of the economy that are to deliver the things that we need in this transition.
I think it's a big subject to look at, society made up of consumers and not citizens. This is what we've been schooled in for decades, and I think the shift is happening. I think, you're saying, are we doing enough? In some respects, of course we're not doing enough, but in some respects there's a lot more happening than we can all see. I think a lot of change is being driven by youth. We generally have we're all older here, but there's a lot of change happening by youth who, in the times that we have with the technology we have power, they have reach, they can mobilise. Look what the 16-year-old Greta has done, in mobilising. And we've all got these different ideas, but we need people to bring that together. And I think the youth are doing a great deal in that. And I think it's conversations between the youth and the wisdom of the older boomers, which will perhaps bring us exactly what we need. Good. Thank you.
Is a symbol, as people have been talking about, for a new economic model, which he talks about for non-violent action and for education. And it's, to me, very, very moving that the Gandhi Foundation decided this year to give the award to Vicky Tauli-Corpuz, who is the UN Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, and Minds and Communities. And these two, in a way, she has been linked with them from the start of Minds and Communities in 2001. And Roger Moody, who's the kind of main person who started Minds and Communities with Andy Whitmore and Richard Solly and others, and many people in other countries. He wanted the award to highlight communities, which Vicky's work also highlights Indigenous communities especially, because, and I very often feel we're all inspired often by Extinction Rebellion, but one of the things they're missing out is the role of mining and metals is so neglected. It's linked with the arms industry that Bruce Kent talked about. It has, for example, the electric car. When one doesn't take the metal into account, it's a massive non-accounting that's happening. And we're not used to looking at metal and mining in that way. And both the voices of Minds and Communities and all the communities represent, and all the Indigenous communities who Vicky is tirelessly visiting and giving hope for, these are voices that need to come out so strongly. And very often people say I or other people are kind of romanticizing the tribal or the indigenous cultures, but they actually, to me, the need to begin to relearn from them. Democracy, like Jaipal Singh Munda, one of the Adivasis in India, reminded Nehru just at the dawn of independence, you can't give us democracy, you have to learn democratic ways from us, because a lot of indigenous communities are models of democracy. Also of law, a law that is not like the Roman way aimed at combative, winners and losers, but reconciliation is the aim of a lot of indigenous legal processes. And of course sustainability, that, you know, the real sustainability is what these people represent. And they are so much under attack these days. So please remind everybody to listen to the voices, and please follow Vicky's work. Even I haven't been looking at her website enough. And Minds and Communities, also linked with London Mining Network, that which is there on. So I don't know the format of this, but maybe do we present the prize now? Or I think have a few words from. Would you like to speak first, Rich?
Thank you very much, Felix, and thank you very much to the Gandhi Foundation, and I think particularly for Felix as well for facilitating in order for us to get this award. It's kind of difficult for me being here in a way next to Vicky, because obviously Vicky is very well known in a personal capacity, very well known in her role within the UN, and Minds and Communities is probably not so well known. So I think in some ways I really want to thank the Gandhi Foundation for giving us some recognition, because it's an organisation that's been going some time, but perhaps as it's not so well known, I should say a little bit about what it is. So, as the name suggests, it's Minds and Communities, so it's very much about working for communities who are affected by mining companies, by particularly large-scale mining companies. And most of that is around providing information to those affected communities, which doesn't sound very radical in and of itself, but actually it's about the provision of truth. It's about giving communities the power, empowering them so that they can resist those companies in their own territories. And I guess the two questions, why mining? Felix has already mentioned some of how ubiquitous mining is in our modern world. And Vicky, earlier on today, you mentioned how it's associated effectively with violence being brought upon communities. So I think it was the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Business and Human Rights who first started much of the UN business and human rights work, who went to look at business and human rights, put together a first paper, and when he did, around 70% of the cases that came back were associated with extractive industries of human rights abuses. So it's clear that it's very much a human rights issue. It's also an environmental issue. And I think one of the reasons that communities resist mining so much is it brings so much pollution and so many negative things to those communities. We talked about economics earlier on, and in terms of economics, again, most of the problems associated with mining are visited upon the communities who are near it, whereas most of the benefits accrue to the companies and the financiers. So, and as for which communities, well, it's nearly all indigenous communities, really. If not that, then land-based communities, because as we've mined out our own country and many other areas, colonialism has driven forward mining into new areas, and now those last areas are not only climate-sensitive areas, but they are pretty much the areas that indigenous people have managed to protect for millennia, really. So that's we also work sometimes, or try to work with the unions, which is perhaps a little bit more difficult, but again, I think we have to recognise the role that workers play, many of whom are also community members. So the organisation is run by an editorial board. We have around 30 editors, and the main intellectual architect behind it is my friend Roger Moody, who's sitting here. And I would like to point out that I think originally they were going to give the award personally to Roger, and it was his humility that led to it, both me sitting here now, but also being an award for the organisation. So thank you to him for that. But also, it was mentioned, my colleague Richard Solly, who's sitting here, who's the coordinator of London Mining Network, but many others, and Vicky, of course, many others who were part, who kind of gets 2 awards, really. Many of whom are in the Global South. And we all came together in 2001 to found the organisation with a declaration called the London Declaration. We met here, and we're effectively based here because London is really the centre of mining companies. 4 of the 5 biggest mining companies in the world are based out of London. Most people don't really know that. You think of the oil companies being here, but the London Bullion Centre is here, the London Metal Exchange, the main industry lobbying body for the big companies is here. So we have to be here as well. We have to talk to that power, we have to talk to that money. And the London Declaration has a few points as sort of central document, but one of that key one, I'll come back to talking truth to power, was that idea that one of the first tenets was to support communities to resist and refute the claims of sustainable mining, of the fact that the industry was greenwashing and pushing these ideas. So it was about empowering them for that. So I think the only last things, I don't really have any other time, the only last thing to say is, we've covered all sorts of issues around the mining industry, but I think 2 I would highlight now of particular interest to us. One is that issue of how you get a just transition, and Felix alluded to it earlier, and it may come up if we're talking about climate change, but we've supported the idea of the transition out of fossil fuels. But one of the key issues now is the Green New Deal was mentioned. A lot of people are talking about a Green New Deal, but a lot of that transition into renewable energy is going to require metals, particularly new metals. For instance, for car batteries, we're talking cobalt and lithium. And it's been a concern of ours, and I think many people are working on this now, that we don't want that new Green Deal, which I support in general, driving yet more aggression into indigenous communities. We need to protect against that and understand that. And then the last point really is, again, Vicky mentioned it earlier on, but is around environmental human rights defenders. Global Witness produced a report this year where they said that the industry, they monitor by countries, and funnily enough, unfortunately, the Philippines was the main country for victims of human rights defenders, but the main industry for those associated is mining. So again, our work becomes ever more necessary. We're run on a shoestring, but we're committed to keep going. And if you're interested in knowing more about our work or the work of London Mining Network, then please chat to us afterwards. But again, thank you very much. We're very much honoured and grateful. Thank you.
Vicky. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, it's an honor and privilege to be given this award by the Gandhi Foundation. As you might have heard, I myself has been, even as a special rapporteur, I was in a list of 600 so-called terrorists in the Philippines last year, in March 8th of last year, and I filed a case before the courts to question what is the status of that allegation, and in the end they removed my name, but still they continue to propagate this allegation. And so having this Gandhi Peace Award, I think will in a way help also say that indeed I'm not a terrorist, I'm an advocate for peace. And this the experience that I went through when I was included in that list, of course, was very scary. But on the other hand, what has really happened is the international community spoke very strongly to support me. Of course, the special rapporteurs in the UN Human Rights Council, even the Undersecretary of the UN who is protecting indigenous peoples who have people who have reprisals against them, spoke out, and many other groups, even the Investors for Human Rights, spoke up to defend me. But the most heartwarming thing was the municipality in my own town also wrote a resolution addressed to the president, as well as the city where I'm living right now, and the province where I come from. There were 3 local government resolutions saying that you are just unjustly accusing somebody that we know who have been very helpful to all the work that's happening in our communities. So we suggest you remove her name from the list, also the others who came from our town. So I think that's really what it means when you are harassed and put in such a list, which can mean really serious threats and risks for your life and your security as well as for your family. The kind of solidarity that comes from all over, from the local up to the global, is something that can really push, changes for the safety of human rights defenders who are in that kind of state. And as was mentioned by Wit, this year the Philippines had the infamy of being the country with the highest numbers of human rights and environmental rights defenders killed. Last year it was Brazil, now it's the Philippines. So we are really in a situation which is not good, and the solidarity, these kinds of awards that you provide to people who are subjected to those kinds of threats and risks will really help a lot in terms of supporting not just myself, but indigenous peoples in general. I can say that I will receive this on behalf of all the indigenous peoples that I'm working with, who have even suffered much more than I have, and who are still fighting and resisting these kinds of harassments mainly from corporations, and of course the military forces who are within those states and their own surrogates. So I hope that we will continue to fight for the peace that we very much need, and to do this in a non-violent ways, and to honor Gandhi in his 150th year. I would like to again commit that I will be continuing and propagating his ideals and his thoughts, and I would use this very much to influence the way indigenous peoples in all parts of the world are asserting and claiming their rights. So thank you very much.
So now we turn to our session on climate change and the environment. Of course, I think Gandhi was an environmentalist almost before his time. There wasn't the climate science that we have today about global warming and extreme weather events, etc. In his day. But I think the way he lived his life and his philosophy and outlook are highly relevant to the problems and challenges we face today, knowing what we do know about the threats that the planet faces. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our 2 experts today on those issues. If I can ask Sister Janti maybe first to speak to us, and thank her once again for hosting us at this wonderful event. You'll see in your biographies that you've got with your delegate packs that she's European Director of the Brahma Kumaris and has been a spiritual leader and teacher for 50 years. and she's dedicated her life to self-transformation and the service of humanity. And I think we can all see that in today's event and the way it's been so wonderfully run, and we've been given such wonderful hospitality. So thank you very much, Sister Janti.
Thank you. It's been a very enlightening morning, and wonderful to hear about the work of the Minds and Vicky. So thank you for all the contributions. The Gandhian voice in terms of the environment to me is very, very loud and clear, and gives us a very powerful message of what it is we need to do at this moment. Firstly, that whole concept of nature being sacred, I don't think it's a concept that's linked only to the East. Sometimes I hear people say that it's very much an Eastern concept. But in fact, I would say that it's actually a concept which is a spiritual concept, which is at the heart of all the different traditions, considering that which has been not created by humans as being sacred. And earlier we had this tantalizing question put to us about what is it that is our preference, and why is it that we think about morality and other aspects, non-violence, as being good. Well, I think that when you think about this word sacred, it has a very beautiful feeling. You instantly get something which is above the physical, above this materialistic world. And so sacred to me, maybe a very simple way to look at it, is that which is not created by humans. And so that means ourselves. We haven't been created by humans. Yes, two people get together, but that's not the beginning or the end of the story. There's a lot more involved in that. So life itself is sacred, but not just human life is sacred. All forms of life, all creatures, little and big and beautiful or not so beautiful, they're all part of life itself. But nature, the earth, the sky, all the elements, nature itself sacred. Somebody sent me a tiny little video yesterday, and it was something that's described as a fire rainbow. And I've never seen it, but this was a little video, and it was incredibly beautiful. And the explanation that was given about a fire rainbow, never heard of this before yesterday, but it described how the clouds have to be quite specific. They have to be at a particular angle. The particles of the clouds have to be at a particular angle. And then when the sun hits those particles and everything is aligned in the way that it should be, you get this amazing phenomenon of the fire rainbow. Anything human beings can create can be beautiful, but I haven't seen anything quite as beautiful within human ingenuity as the fire rainbow. And I'm sure that applies to coral reefs, that applies to all sorts of things that we would say are part of nature itself. And I think that's actually the whole crux of the situation with the environment today. If we stop seeing nature as being matter and inanimate, and we begin to see nature again, as our traditions have told us always, that it is sacred, then in that consciousness of that which is sacred, we become the trustees, the custodians, to be able to care for nature. Because humans, for whatever reason, our fortune, our responsibility, our destiny, we have the responsibility of caring for whether it's all other living creatures or nature itself. And so, to what extent have we been able to fulfill this responsibility? Well, that's not just a rhetorical question. We know what the answer is. There's no other species that actually destroys its own nest. A nature that has been so generous and abundant and given us so much, and we very consciously destroy to the point of now near collapse. So what do we do about this? Yes, we can plant trees, we can have, and Brahma Kumaris have planted millions of trees. Yes, we can also have a simpler lifestyle, which we advocate and practice. Yes, we can have vegan diet or vegetarian diet, which again reduces carbon footprint in a big way. Yes, we can also have solar energy, which we have. Our organization in India, the headquarters in Abu, we prepare 3 meals a day for 25,000 to 30,000 people at a time, and that is all by solar power. And we have India One, which is the first of its kind in India, which is able to supply electric power, heat and light for whatever purpose, cooking, water, etc., water heating, etc., on a 24/7 basis. And those of you who are into the technical details, you know that part of the story is the storage of heat. So to have light during the day when there's sunshine, it's okay. What about the night? What about the time when there isn't that sunshine available? So it was all done by research and development by people who are meditators and involved in this, by a handful of people actually, and then a whole big team around them. So we're doing all of that, but that's not actually what we believe. We believe that, yes, all those things are, as they are, important, but the essence is the change of heart, the change of consciousness. And just as when I see matter, nature, and I say it's inanimate, well, that's a very narrow, limited perspective, which is very far from the truth. In the same way, when I see myself in just the physical identity, and I'm associating all the things that are external to me, the inner being, then in that consciousness, I'm very, very far away from the reality. Coming back to the awareness of my own spiritual identity and letting go of the ego of my material identity, which is connected with gender, age, color, race, religion, culture, language, possessions, position, all those things and plenty more. But when my identity is associated with all of those things, I've lost touch with that which is sacred within my own being. And coming back to an awareness of my own spiritual identity, coming to that awareness of my inner being, I'm in touch with the treasures that I carry within. We were using human values earlier, that particular term. And I'd like to use the word spiritual values, or even original values, the original values of the inner being. When I lose touch with the happiness, the love, the peace, the truth that I carry within my own being, then I'm looking for all of that from outside. And there's a bus route that goes from here to a very big shopping mall. It's a whole big complex, huge, Brent Cross. And there's an advert on the bus that used to say, and maybe there's still one around somewhere, but buy till you drop. And it's actually talking about buying from people who are going to deliver to you. And so you buy and they'll drop. But that idea that our happiness comes from things. And so we have the consumer society, and many of the subjects that came up this morning are very much connected with this whole syndrome of buying and our identity linked with possessions and external things. And when I discovered that the reality, the truth is that there's happiness within, I shift my consciousness to the being inside. I connect with that inner joy and love. I know that happiness can't be bought. I know that love cannot be bought. It is there for me to discover within. And so as we shift our consciousness back again to this awareness of who we truly are and that inner identity, I think that we'll have found the key to be able to create a future that we can all enjoy in equality, in justice, in love and harmony.
For those of you concerned, I am taking notes, not checking my emails and etc., which I have been accused of when I stand on these stages. But I do like to capture my own notes of events, especially when hearing such wise words. So thank you, Sister Chanti. Now I'd like to turn to Lindsay. I had the privilege of going to the Cuno summer school in Geneva about 18 years ago. And for those of you who don't know, the Quaker United Nations office, I think in New York and in Geneva, runs a course for students for a week or two where you learn about, you visit the UN institutions and the WTO and some other institutions, and you learn about the fantastic work that the UN that the Quakers do often behind the scenes to resolve conflicts. And the Quakers in the UN have a range of specialists who champion different causes, and Lindsay's one of those on climate change. So we're now going to hear from her, and it's very timely with all the stuff that's been going on in New York over the past week with Greta and Donald and everyone else, and Boris gathering in New York to discuss climate change. So thank you, Lindsay.
Is this good? It's nice to sit back. Is this all right? That's really lovely to hear. He didn't tell me this before, so this is a lovely, lovely surprise. And actually reminded me that the Quaker United Nations office, we were talking about engaging on climate change and the environment for a number of years, and the response was, we're not environmental specialists. And it wasn't until we began to have Quakers saying, no, this is peace. This is a peace concern and this is a justice concern, that we then created a program, and I'm the representative. I have been asked to look at how urgent is climate change, how does industrialization contribute to it, and how should our way of life change to deal with it adequately. So I'm going to try to briefly do each of the three, but then I want to talk about how that connects to what I understand Gandhi was saying in his life and doing in his life, and how does that inspire me in what I see today happening in terms of people standing up and saying we need to do something about this. So briefly, I just returned from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm going to be a little bit geeky for a few minutes because this is the science organization that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 that advises all the governments on the latest science of what's happening in the climate and surrounding related environment. And there was a report on oceans and the cryosphere. So you may have heard this on the news. It was just brought out this week. And the Quakers are the only faith-based organization who are representatives there. Brahma Kumaris could easily become one. And that's an interesting position to be in, to have a kind of come through the ethical side, the human impact. So how urgent is climate change? I think everybody's been saying this today. It's urgent. I don't need to tell you that. And I think it was also said today that the more we delay, the less chance we have in the near future to influence the stabilization. So this is the critical moment. This is why we're saying action now is so important. And the main points that I often say is that I don't think climate change is the biggest challenge to humanity. I think that climate change is a symptom. And the greatest challenge is how do we live sustainably and justly on this earth? Because as you probably know, the unprecedented challenges or the unprecedented rates of change in our human history are not just rates of temperature rise, they're also rates of species extinction, rates of ocean acidification and oxygen reduction, rates of land degradation, and rates of chemical pollution. And they're all interconnected in that many of the things feeding climate change are feeding these other environmental crises. For climate change, we have increased 1 Celsius since the pre-industrial, and we're headed to a total of plus 4.8 Celsius by 2100. Basically, that is too fast for people to adapt to, for land to adapt to, without massive suffering. So I'm not going to go into, this sort of heavy stuff, but I think the first time I heard about climate change, someone described it as in the melting of the last small ice age. we would experience a warming of maybe 0.5 to 1 Celsius in 1,000 years. And we're looking at, we've just done one, and we're looking at another +3 in 150 to 200. That's what we're dealing with right here, and it doesn't have to happen, and that is why this is a moral call to conscience. So just briefly on the oceans that has come out, one of the main scientists said, acting fast now and urgently deep decarbonization rather than waiting or doing it as we're doing now, where emissions are still increasing. It's the difference, quote, between an unimaginable problem and one that humans can deal with. And of course, they were looking at glaciers, ice sheets, freshwater implication, biodiversity, etc., ocean acidification. All this was coming up. It was a very profound report, and you can see it online, and there's a summary, and you can see what your governments know, but also what your governments have approved. A lot of these reports are now being used in the courts to say our governments have seen this or advised on this, and they're not acting fast enough. In land, the report came out in August, and what the main message was is that right now land is a sink, right? It's sinking in, just as oceans, what we're producing, but it will become a source if we do not act fast, because you have ecosystems collapse, you have permafrost melting, which it already is, and then it has. What we don't want to have happen is when it goes into runaway, when it gets to that point where the release is such. So the good news was the 1.5 report last year, and I see this as good news because the thing about this report said that it is possible to hold temperatures at 1.5, which nobody actually thought they could when the Paris Agreement put this in. And if we do this, and there were pathways of how to do it, and there's a pathway that is based on sustainable activities with no geoengineering. If we do this, and this is the word I like, this is what we can save. Save is really important, I think, to inspire action. We can save, and this is even between half a degree, between 1.5 and 2, millions of people from profound suffering, loss of life and livelihoods, thousands of species from extinction, chances we can save for sustainable development, inequality reduction, and poverty eradication, save and protect many ecosystems from irreversible destruction, including, and this is the key, after 1.6 was what the answer was given, was the irreversible melting of the Greenland ice cap. So this is why these temperatures are so important and so close. And we would save the ability for many of the most vulnerable countries to continue living, to have their livelihoods. Some will be profoundly affected and be less so, but this is what we're looking at, the ability to ensure that the most vulnerable now and our future generations have this chance to live on this earth in a way that is without the profound suffering that would happen if we carry on with just our way of going at it right now. And that, for me, is actually a really inspiring message, in a sense. I suppose I'm a bit of a fighter, being a pacifist Quaker, but that was something for me that really energized. And it's energized the community, and it's energized Britain in the last, I don't know, but if I look around, even my parents-in-law are talking about climate change, which is a special thing for me, but that's another story. Industrialization. Someone mentioned recently that when the scientists started coming out with all this information, they probably had no idea that what their findings were saying was that we have to transform our economic, our political, and our social systems. I don't think they had an idea that they were walking into this extraordinary controversy, but that's basically what the consequence is. And when we talk about industrialization, it's one way to put it, but I would make it even broader. We're looking at how do we source energy, how do we grow our food, what do we eat, how do we build our buildings, how do we travel, how do we raise our families, and how many, and at the core, how do we protect nature from future human damage. And I think, Sister Jayanti, we're talking about the sacred and the protection of nature, which at this stage is not by any means strong enough. And then when we talk about decarbonization and we talked about diet, 1/5 of emissions could happen from changes of diet. 1/5 of the reduction we need. And the natural climate solutions, the amazing amount of restoration of nature, which is a profound understanding that we're seeing now, and how much has been degraded and how much restoration would help in addition to reducing our damage and our carbon, and not just carbon, the methane, our greenhouse gas emissions. So for many of us, and I think everyone in this room would see this as a moral call to conscience. Yeah, what we do now is affecting the most vulnerable and the youngest and all our future generations. What is the legacy we want to leave? Even if I alone and you alone cannot change this, what is the legacy and the story of what we were part of to make this happen? When I think of Gandhi, I put a list of what I understood of what he was trying to say to us in his life journey, and how that relates to what I'm seeing in terms of not just climate change, but in terms of how we're trying to rebuild how we live on this earth. His journey of realization of the injustice around him, and in turn his refusal to see an immoral situation as acceptable, as with apartheid in South Africa and then with colonization in India, just watching how he grew in that as he got older and what he did with that. His understanding that injustice must be witnessed publicly. Journalists would go with him, because if it's not witnessed publicly, if you're not seen, then it doesn't challenge those in power. Those in power have to be able to see that injustice being challenged. They have to see it and witness that injustice and ask, do I live with this inaction? Do I ignore it? Do I act? It makes us ask, who are we? His determination to witness the equal brotherhood and sisterhood in humanity, the determination for actions to remain non-violent. The moment they become violent, any violence against the oppressed would be justified by the oppressor. And non-violence makes the act harder to ignore and harder not to touch the heart within us. The determination to be a personal witness before preaching to others of what to do, and the refusal to hate those who oppress us. They are to our brothers and sisters in humanity, and to act in love, not anger. So I'd like to finish with this concept of personal witness and political action. Quakers and many other faiths, the abolition of slavery is a strong story in history. And in the abolition of slavery, it was fine to say, well, I'm not going to have a slave, I'm not going to own a slave, but that wasn't going to change slavery. But it was critical to have that personal witness to then engage politically. So this sense of what we do in our lives, we are setting that example. And no guilt that you're imperfect. We are all imperfect. There's always more we could do. But we are starting and we are on our journey. The student protests that we're seeing, I have negotiators at the international climate negotiations. We work with negotiators off the record to help build communication and understanding between countries. And we met in June, and what they wanted to talk about, this is a diverse group of countries, some of which are at war with each other. They said, I want to talk about the students. Can we talk about what's going on? And I share that back. I'm speaking to a school on Monday. I'm going to share that message that this is making a difference. The Extinction Rebellion. I have people, negotiators, and you'll hear your decision makers saying people don't want to change. It's harder for them to say that now, isn't it? We've got people on the streets saying we need action, and that's what's such a gift. And then finally, I was thinking about our brave Greta from Sweden. I read in my home country is the States that when she went to visit Congress and she was asked for her press release, which is what you're supposed to do before you speak to a congressional panel, she handed them a copy of the IPCC report. So that is the speaking truth to power, and to bring witness to a world that humanity can transform to ensure the most vulnerable now and our future generations do not have to suffer. We haven't got it in our only contribution, but together, that is the power. And we mentioned Hitler before. Hitler couldn't do what he did alone. Reverse that to the positive. We need each other to do the beautiful vision forward, because the way we're living now is not going to last anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and Sister Janti. I think I'm right, Rachel, we've got about 15, just over 15 minutes for questions, I think. So I might take 3 at a time, and you might want to say who you are. If you do, feel free. So I'll probably take 3 questions, if that's all right, and then you can pick and choose, perhaps. So can I have a show of hands if anyone would like to ask any questions? Yeah, the lady by the camera.
Sister Jayanti very much touched up the environmental issue and the climatic change issue perfectly according to the Gandhian voice and the Gandhian philosophy. And it was so soothing to listen to you, Sister Jayanti. And Lindsay's talk on the other areas of climatic change also was very informative. I would like to add here, one of the reasons for climatic change, or rather erosion of many of our resources, is also the animal rearing industry, which is progressing in a very rapid way all over the world. They consume much more water than any other human beings consume, and they totally destroy the land so that nothing can be cultivated later on. So this we can try to reduce by introducing something called meat-free days, because the consumption of meat has been increasing day by day, and it needs to be reduced. So we can introduce meat-free days. In Europe, already in some of the districts or places, they have introduced meat-free days, like Ghent has one, and of course in Poland they have 3 days meat-free days. So can we also have, if we canvass, we can have such days in different parts of the world, and this eventually can help us to reduce some amount of deforestation, and we can improve the climate conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Yeah, gentlemen.
Hello, my name is Madhava. My question particularly to Lindsay. It's a wonderful work you have been doing, but is there any discussion, the bombs that are getting dropped everywhere across the world, they would create climate impact, especially the war that is happening in Syria. Everywhere across, there's a lot of war theaters that are taking place. Once you drop a bomb, it actually impacts. It's like, have you heard of butterfly effect? The butterfly that actually it does impact. A bomb can create huge, it can impact the atmosphere, 1 kilometer radius atmosphere, and it creates that it actually can punch the ozone layer. And there are bombs which are dropped which actually puncture the ozone layer. Yeah. And have you, Quakers organization, or anyone within the United Nations, have you ever went and said, stop this war because you are actually blowing the planet apart?
In looking at climate change, it seems to me some aspects of the causes are not looked at enough. One is war, as he said, where both the arms industry and trade that Bruce was mentioning and the wars themselves are huge causes. Also, the mining and metals industry. And another one is the tapping of groundwater. In India, for example, people don't realize, because it's not highlighted enough by many people, the extent of groundwater extraction that is happening. So it's almost like in India, as many other countries, parts of the earth are actually literally drying up. So looking at some of deeper aspects of climate change and how we are, the mindset is conditioned to that, as Sister Jayanti was saying. Thank you.
So 2 linked questions there on the impact of war, and going back to what Felix was saying about mines and metals, and also meat-free days. You talked about 1/5 of the change we need coming through diet. So I don't know if you've got any comments.
Sister Jayanti, did you want to go first? No? The reason we became observers of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was because we felt they did not have enough research collated on sustainable behavior changes. So that was our push. There was talk about geoengineering that was going, and they weren't even looking at diet, for example. That is changing dramatically. So I just want to say, in terms of agriculture, it's between 25 to 30%. It was a huge part of the land report that came out in August. And as you say, but also 30% of food is wasted. So not only are we looking at reducing meat and dairy, the most effective diet to have is a vegetarian is next, but actually dairy has a huge impact too. But this is a statistic that struck me. Approximately 80 million people are facing malnutrition in the world, but some 2 billion are either overweight or obese. And that reflects the state we're in as humanity. But agriculture and food is a profound side of it, and we know that. We know fossil fuels is the first, intensive agriculture, deforestation, all connected. And that brings me to, just briefly, so yes, war. Well, Quakers, we quote often 1.6 trillion per year on military expenditure and very little climate finance. We're always looking at what's actually protecting your citizens, the effects of military. We had the first, in Geneva, the first event at a peace week that happens once a year in Geneva at the UN that connected climate change, conflict, and peace building. So it's something that we push, but we see it building a lot. And in fact, oddly, the military are one of the most practical people on climate change because they're always dealing with effects. So when you talk to a military person on the effects of climate change or within their effects in their own, they will talk about it very bluntly in ways that politicians often don't. It's been a very interesting experience for me. And the deeper aspects of climate change, they're all connected. And I think that's, I don't want to say that's the beauty of it, but that's the healing side of it. When you change what you're eating and how you're traveling and what you're consuming, you're not just being a contribution toward stabilizing temperature rise. You're helping stabilize soil degradation. You're helping stabilize ocean acidification and species extinction and the profound chemical pollution we're seeing when you're buying organics rather than... So all these things are connected, and that's why I often say climate change isn't the greatest challenge. It's how we live sustainably and justly.
Thank you very much. We've got a round of...
Sister Jayanti.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, Sister Jayanti, sorry.
That's okay. I think it's a reference that goes straight back to Gandhi in terms of what it is we eat and what's going on in our minds. And his connection was that while our diet is based on violence and meat, etc., all is based on violence, including dairy. If all of that comes from violence, then that violence is generated within the human consciousness, and our acts are going to be violent, and there can never be peace in the world. I haven't got the phrase of that in precise words, but that was a concept that he was proposing. And so change of diet is actually not just a question of climate change in terms of water and soil, it's land, etc. All of that is true, but it's also the impact it's having on our mind and the violence that's being generated. This morning we heard about the preamble in the Charter of the UN. I want to refer to the preamble of the Charter of UNESCO, which talks about wars begin in the minds of men, and it means men and women. So wars begin in the minds of men, and the seeds of peace have to be planted therein. And so diet, our consciousness, our minds are very totally linked with the whole subject of war and peace and bombs, and whether it's sticks and stones we throw at each other or bombs, it's part of that scenario of violence. The second thing that I want to talk about is the subject of lifestyle. And I remember that in Paris, 2015, I think it was a maximum number of world leaders that had come together. And partly it was in support for France, because it was after a huge act of terrorism, and France had the courage to go on with the climate change conference. But also it was because of the Paris Agreement that had to be signed. And there was a big comment going around at that time, Lindsay will remember. So many people were saying that political leaders, presidents and prime ministers, were talking like preachers. because they were talking about lifestyle change. They were talking about dedication, commitment, sacrifice, things like this that you normally wouldn't hear political leaders talk about. And so the big question is, I want to change, but my habits are such that they prevent me from changing. Now, how do I change my habits? Well, where does a habit begin? It begins right here. I have a thought, it comes through into action, that's it. A habit is created. 2 times, 3 times action, and you've created the imprint for a habit. So how do I change my mindset? And it doesn't happen just because I say I want to change it. It happens when I have inner spiritual power. And you won't be surprised, I come to the subject of meditation or prayer, quiet time, reflection, whatever it is I choose for my own style of living, and within my own culture. But I need to make time for myself to be able to energize the inner being so that then I have the capacity, the power to have the willpower to make the changes in my life that I know I need to make now, not tomorrow or the next day or the next day. So I see that the spiritual dimension of Gandhiji's life is very clear. He would never say, I'm a Hindu, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Hindu, I'm not a Jew, none of those things, but his approach was a spiritual approach, an approach that was connected with the inner core values of a human being, not the external rituals or the scriptures. And so I think the spiritual approach is really the way forward.
Thank you. It's a running theme. I think what's been great about today, I think, is we're being guided on. There are massive challenges, global challenges that we face, but there's there's so much we can do as individuals to change that. So that's really empowering, I think. I'm noticing we're creeping up to 10 past. If there's any burning last questions, are there any burning last questions from the floor? There is one burning last question, the lady.
So from the morning, it was a beautiful sharing with all of us. So on my observation, I was just like to put only one word. So solution to the world problems, whatever it may be, as Jayanti Didi was stating, that consciously changing inside. So we talk about the climate change, we talk about the global change, but let the change comes inside, means inside to out approach. So we are trying to make change in the outside world, but let the change be inside. And the second thing, so we are looking about the exponential change, or it may be a growth, or it may be a linear growth, but the growth should be ethical growth. Maybe in the individual level, or it may be in the economics, or whatever it may be, but it should be ethical. Ethical in the sense, I just like to add the word values, the inner values, the core values which is inside us. When the inner values will be in the action, so then naturally everything gets changed. That's why that is a very beautiful thing. So because I'm working on the value education, and very particularly very recent years, I'm working with the lifetime prisoners. So as brother was stating about the bombs and all those things, so very long time, by giving the value education in a very academic way in India, so my own personal experience is, so those who have committed very particularly in the society, very big criminal activities, or those who are responsible for the bomb blast and all those things, taking up the Brahma Kumaris syllabus, value education programs, they started changing inside. Their behavior has started changing, and the government of Tamil Nadu started witnessing that those criminals changed their own personality. That's why they are getting released from the bar too, and right now they are working for the peace for the society. So the every change should be from the inside to out. So values cannot be taught, but it has to be caught. So we are from the morning, so we could able to experience lot of values from here, because when we talk about the non-violence, when we talk about the other values, but the values We are just what we are experiencing right now. So when we put in the action, naturally, so all the problems, what we are facing in the globe, then it will be a solution to the world problems.
Okay, thank you very much. Did you say, Sister Genty, was there one last comment from the floor? Graham.
It is a question rather than a comment. All the emphasis in this session has been on individual response, change of lifestyle. Most, I would say, of my friends and associates take the attitude, I've got money to live as I please and maintain my polluting lifestyle. The law allows them to. Why should I change? And I want to ask the speakers, if they can briefly, to talk about political involvement. How should we get engaged with the political system of this country, and how long will it take to introduce laws which actually curb people's extravagant and wasteful lifestyle?
Thank you, Graham. You talked about personal witness and political change. Do you want to kick off with that, Lindsay, in closing, and then we'll have to close the session after.
Personal witness and political action are essential together. And I think you need one for the other. I don't think that all of us suddenly living sustainably will change without laws as well, right? But you have to speak from your source. The political action that is happening, and we mentioned Extinction Rebellion, mentioned the students. When you start seeing people on the streets, and this is where Gandhi is so powerful. I had to watch the film again for my daughter, was studying colonialization in school. And I watched the film Gandhi again, and I hadn't seen it for maybe 2 decades, and it hit me like, this is what we're seeing, and we have to remember, do not become violent, show the injustice of what's happening, make that immorality so clear, but show that you are making a stand, because watch how quickly Parliament suddenly had to engage. And then just finally, yes, we have to have political action, we have to have global action, but I think Britain, being the birth of industrialization, has a historical responsibility to be a leader. Your delegation at the IPCC meeting this week was very, very good. The EU is the most progressive as well. They speak differently. The EU is actually an observer in this. The most progressive, probably developed bloc. A long way to go, but we need to be leaders. And you're being a leader with this kind of action on the streets that's pushing Parliament. And then the last thing I was going to say is when we talk about laws that help change lifestyle, we've got to tax extraction. We've got to tax the oil companies rather than just the people buying the petrol. It's got to be from the source of those who make the most money, because the reasons this isn't happening fast is because the root causes driving these crises are very lucrative activities. Slavery was a very lucrative activity, and most people in Parliament made money off it. How did they get it? They did a law. But that took huge amounts of time and money. So it's strategic, but go for where the money is being made. Thank you. And use that money to support those who are the poorest, who are affected. Sorry.
Sister Janti, any closing remarks on that, or any of the other questions or comments?
I think that essentially human nature is of goodness, and I think we can appeal to the goodness of human nature. Just connecting something back to British society, I also have a question whether if it had not been the British, had it been any other nation that had colonized India, would the Gandhi policy of non-violence have worked? And maybe not, but it was the British, and I think what happened was something within the moral compass changed there, and so that kicked in, and so decolonization began. And so I think that yes, here in Britain we can be leaders and we can kick off something. Extinction Rebellion has started here. That's interesting just by itself. So I think that we can start shaking the question of what is right and what is wrong and make people think. And ultimately, we are in the same boat. Today, I say I have money to buy food. The poor in 5 years' time in Britain won't have enough money to buy food. There's agricultural collapse ahead of us. But ultimately, it's the one boat, and the water is leaking in one side, the other side isn't going to remain safe. It's not possible.
I put these out, but they're all gone. It's called the Government Officials Toolkit Inspiring Urgent Action. We made it for people to be able to take to their MPs or whomever they were visiting, because everything in here is a quote from a published paper, most of which are UN or government-based, to have something to empower you to say, hand it to them, what are you doing about it? Yeah? Because often it's a matter of confidence that stops us. So it's online, Government Officials Toolkit, QUNO. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a good note to add on. Just a brief plug for George Paxton, our editor. He's written a book on non-violent resistance to the Nazis, because it's often raised as an issue. You know, if Gandhi faced the Nazis, it wouldn't have worked. But George Paxton, the editor of our newsletter, has written a big book on non-violent resistance to the Nazis and how it can work. So even the worst regimes can be challenged through non-violent means. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not quite sure what exactly to say, but I take it that my remit is to say something about the Gandhian views on questions that we have discussed and how adequate or inadequate they are, because that's what has been the theme of the workshop. Now, the first thing, the important thing to bear in mind, that in Gandhi's case, the most important value that he wanted to realize in his life was non-violence. Truth was important. There's a different level of contradiction. He was interested both in truth and non-violence, and the two could not sometimes go together. Which one then was more important? But that's a different story. We didn't go into it. He was essentially seen as a man of non-violence, thanks largely to the Christian missionaries. Because Gandhi can be read in many different ways. And the Christians started a tradition of thinking of him essentially as a man of non-violence. Because this is how it's in the image of Christ that they saw Gandhi. Lots of people compared him to Jesus of the 20th century. And what was common between him and Jesus? The answer is, turn the other cheek. That's what Jesus said. Gandhi said non-violence. Far deeper than turning the other cheek, but nevertheless, the idea of non-violence. So Gandhi has been lumbered, rightly or wrongly, with this picture, that he was committed to non-violence, and the question was, how should an individual, as well as a collectivity, lead a truly non-violent life? What does a non-violent life look like, and how do you realize it in practice? That was the question with which Gandhi wrestled all his life. Now, the important question here is, what do you mean by non-violence? What is non-violence? Extend to where? And here I think Gandhi made some very important distinctions and discoveries. First of all, as I said earlier, non-violence for Gandhi was not really an important concept. The important concept for him was love, caritas. How do you express your love for your fellow human beings? And the basis of love is Advaita, the metaphysical idea of oneness of all human beings, that you are no different from me, you are me in a different shape, and because of this oneness, I love you as much as I love him. So love became far more important, and non-violence was simply an expression of it. Which is why, as I said in the morning, non-violence can lead to violence. Very simple example which Gandhi discovered. In his ashram there was a calf suffering from an interminable illness. Hardly a week to go before it would die. Doctors were called, doctors said it wouldn't survive. Everyone knew this. What do you do? Leave the calf as it is or kill it? Now Gandhi was asked, what should we do? He thought several hours about it. And then he said, give an injection, kill it. Why? I can't bear to see this creature in intense pain for a whole week. At the end of the day, the result is going to be the same. So, the calf was killed. In Gandhi's weekly paper, there was a big controversy. Lots of giants and others wrote articles saying you are a violent man and this is an act of violence and how could you do this? And Gandhi's reply was very interesting. It involved violence, but it was not a violent act. It involved violence in terms of giving the injection, but it was not a violent act because I was not trying to harm it. I was in fact trying to relieve its pain. So that means what? That non-violence would mean that a violence used to help somebody is non-violence? All kinds of rigmarole. I don't want to go into it, but Gandhi really gets into difficulty in sorting out the concept of non-violence. And basically what he means is, as far as possible, your concern should be not only not to inflict injury, but also to love your fellow human beings and share your resources with them. But then is it all about, this kind of practice, all that non-violence is about? No. And this is where he takes the idea much further than the earlier thinkers. Non-violence of thought. You can think violently, not think of violence, you can think violently, angry, or you can think non-violently. You can feel violently, or you can feel non-violently. You can judge somebody, gossip somebody, or you may refuse to do that kind of thing. So violence for him extended not only to behavior, but also to thought and feelings. You don't gossip about people, because gossip is a form of demeaning them, talking about them behind your back, harming them. So the idea of non-violence was extended to such a degree that it became not only how to lead a certain kind of life, but how to think, how to lead, and how to transform myself so completely that nothing about me smacks of violence. Now that was at one level a very difficult ideal to achieve. Gandhi knew that he didn't, that hardly anyone has, which is right unto the end of your life, to be utterly non-violent or in your thought and words and deeds. The other important thing was about non-violence, can you lead? Is the human condition such that it can allow you to lead non-violent life? And Gandhi said no. In Sanskrit there is a sentence which he quoted, Jivo jivasya jivanam. Life is the life of life. That every living being kills a living being in order to live. Mosquitoes bite me. If I have to kill them or they will kill me. Snakes, lots of little things where I have no choice. I eat my food, and when I eat my food I swallow a few germs or a few microorganisms. That's violence. What do? Stop eating? So you have got to work out a principled compromise. What are the limits of non-violence, and what are the areas where violence is permissible or unacceptable, or acceptable. And there again, I think the important thing was when he realized in 1942, Satyagraha, and people got very angry and very disturbed at the way in which the British brutally treated Indian people. They said, well, look, we are not going to tolerate these kinds of nonsense. Some people got very angry and understandably threw stones. And Gandhi was asked how he defended this. And he said, I defend it because this is virtually non-violence. Polish resistance to Hitler. It's tiny, like a rat, as Gandhi said, a rat's resistance to a cat. Is it violence? It's virtually non-violence. It's a permissible violence. So he introduced the category of understandable or permissible or necessary violence. Necessary violence is jivo jivasya jivanam, without which you can't live. That is necessary violence. Permissible violence is one where, understandable violence is where you have no alternatives, you are so desperate. And here, increasingly, he changed his views on one fundamental thing, which became very important during the last days of the partition. The last days of partition, 10 million people migrated from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India. And about 1.3 million were wiped out, they killed each other. Now, in that kind of situation, lots of cases arose where somebody would come and right in front of me, kidnap my wife or rape her. What do? Do I do satyagraha in front of this wretched man? What does one do? Initially, Gandhi said, no woman can be raped unless she is willing a partner. When she's a willing partner, she must resist. He began to realize, lots of women wrote to him saying, you are talking nonsense, think more carefully. And as Gandhi began to think carefully, he said that in situations like this, where one madman suddenly comes and starts shooting everybody, I'm perfectly entitled to shoot him back. Otherwise, people will be dead. And is that what I want? Because then I would be responsible for the violence done to them. I may not do it, but this idiot might do violence to all those people, kill 20 people, somebody comes into this room. What do I do? So Gandhi said, in that kind of situation, violence to this man is permissible. You can shoot him. So lots of little contradictions, modifications, but changes in Gandhi's thinking. And that to me is the greatness of the man, that he was constantly prepared to rethink his earlier views. As he once said, he was growing from truth to truth, from one idea to another. Life throws up contradictions. And in response to those contradictions, he would change his views or modify them. So all this is an indication that when we talk of Gandhi, we should not freeze him. If you take a quotation from Gandhi in 1930, I can match it with a quotation taken from Gandhi in 1947, and there will be two different Gandhis. And as Gandhi said, when that kind of thing happens, my last statement must be taken as authentic. The earlier ones I have outgrown. So the first thing I want to alert all of you, is that Gandhi is not simply Gandhi frozen at a particular point in history, which is Gandhi constantly evolving, thinking, changing, and until the end of his life, changing. So, and that's where the next point that I want to make comes up. So if you want to think Gandhi further, then you continue his journey from where he left off in 1948, 30th of January, when he was killed. His experiments were not complete. He continued to make contradictions. In a Gandhian spirit, how do you cope with these new challenges? And here, the nuclear weapons thing comes up. What would be Gandhian response to nuclear weapons? Atom bomb had been dropped in Hiroshima, which Gandhi knew, and he was asked, he was asked what to do, and he said, I would come out into the street and tell the pilot I love him and all that. But that was not his considered answer, because his whole definition of violence was conceived in a certain historical context with which he was familiar. The warfare. It's only toward the end that the bomb from the air became a reality. Then it expanded further. What would Gandhi have said about nuclear weapons? You can't see your opponent. You can't plead with him. You can't do satyagraha in front of him. What do you do when you can't see your opponent and where you are confronting a machine-like system? That's what a workshop like this, which we have tried to do in our own way, should ask itself. How do we do Gandhi to Gandhi? Gandhi dying in 48, experiments coming to an end. If he had lived on, what would have been his experiences and what would have been his conclusions? So that's the second point I want to make. And I have some ideas on what he would have done, but that will take a long time to articulate. The third point is, which Gandhi knew about, couldn't resolve in any way, which was what would be Gandhi's attitude to Jews in extermination camps. 6 million people, Jews, homosexuals, blacks and others, were wiped out by Hitler. Now Gandhi was asked by various Jewish scholars who worshipped him, Martin Buber and a few others, saying, Gandhiji, you are the leader of mankind, you care for mankind, tell me what would you like my people to do? And they are in extermination camp, they have been debilitated, they can't even stand straight, they can't even eat. There's an article which came out recently, many of them could not have menstruation because they were so terrified that their children will take away, that their bodily mechanism had been so thoroughly violated. Utterly destitute, fragile creatures. 1944. What would you like them to do? They can't stand up and say satyagraha. They can't even speak. They're almost glued to each other, human beings glued to each other. What do you do with them? And Gandhi had an answer of some kind. His first answer was, well, look, they are going to be killed anyway. Why can't they therefore put up a resistance non-violently and get killed? They will get killed in non-violent resistance, but they are going to be killed anyway. Why not die with dignity? He also had this very beautiful but at the same time tricky concept of the art of dying. He said that violence is about the science of killing. Non-violence is about the art of dying. That a non-violent man should not be attached to his life and should be able to say, I will not do this, Mr. Hitler. Do what you like to me. Kill me, what do I care? Now that spirit of art of dying, and he says in many of his later writings, he said, death comes to everybody. But what we want is a beautiful death, a noble death. A death, he said, the body will go. I mean, we all die. What is the problem about it? We all die. The question is that after our death, the memory of the death, the principle for which we stood, will continue to resonate through history, shape people, and reduce the acts of violence in future. That's what he expected. A noble death is a kind of cultural treasure, which we cherish, we talk about it in memories and so on. He said, let Jews do this. Now, at one level, it's an attractive answer. At another level, it's not an attractive answer. Because 3-4 million people butchered in this way. The other answer that Gandhi gives is that before we get to the situation like this, non-violence should have been practiced. In 30s and 40s, when they were being rounded up, they should have said, sorry, we don't. That's when resistance was appropriate, not when they had been reduced to walking skeletons. And that made sense, because in Germany in 1938, when several Jewish husbands of non-Jewish wives, Aryan wives, were kidnapped, were taken away, the women put up a resistance, went to Berlin, 200 of them, and protested, saying, we will not put up with it. And Nazis had no choice but to give in. Because otherwise this was going to spread in all over Germany. So the simple point is that before it gets to an extermination camp-like situation, one should start intervening, like in Norway, isn't it? In Norway there are lots of people whom Hitler dared not touch. In Sweden quite a few people were saved. In Germany itself, peaceful resistance he couldn't. It's only when it became totalitarian and impersonal system that it became difficult to protest. So Gandhi's answer would be, start acting early, not leave it until the last. But then the question is, how early is early? When do you know what is early? When do you know it is late? Few Jews are rounded up and you will say, well, it's too early. Let's see what more happens. And you see what happens next. Suddenly, it's impossible to do anything. So these are tricky questions, and the Mahatma was acutely aware of this. And especially on the question of the Jews, with which I have wrestled, many other people have wrestled, was also applied in the case of Palestine. What would Gandhi do? What would be his answer on the question of Palestine? And he has much to say. I don't want to go into this now, but he has much to say that is interesting. But nevertheless, here was a man who had no difficulty in allowing the government of India to send troops to Kashmir. When Pakistani raiders invaded, and the Maharaja had no choice, he asked the government of India for accession. Nehru went to Gandhiji, and Gandhi said, look, you can't do anything unless he asks your help. Nehru went and asked the Maharaja of Kashmir, he sent a wire, and the Maharaja said, I accede. Instrument of accession was signed. Then Gandhi said, well, look, there is no choice. Send troops. So you have to bear in mind that here was a man of the point simply is, here is a man of violence, but how difficult the whole terrain of non-violence is, how delicate, painful choices have to be made in different situations, and how this man kept making choices, some regretting and different choices next time. So I want to emphasize the vitality, the experimental character of his life. So when he said at the end of the day, and I think absolutely rightly, my life is my text. After I'm gone, you can burn my writings, you can only learn from my life. And what we learn from my life is this constant experimental questioning and vitality. So we have discussed this side. There are other two areas where I think he's quite relevant. The economic model. We had a good discussion on this. I don't want to take up too much time. But he was opposed to capitalism. He was opposed to communism. He was opposed to disarmament. He was opposed to advocacy. He was opposed to complicity. He was opposed to disarmament. He was opposed to disarmament. He was opposed to for all kinds of reasons, obvious reasons. The question for him was, what is the alternative? Now, at one level, his first question was, you don't have a right to property. He said, the very idea of right to property is clumsy. How can you have a right to property? You have worked for it, but who are you? You are a product of somebody's labor. Your talents are not yours. You didn't create your own talents. You didn't create your own character. So all those resources that you have with which you can acquire property are not yours. If they are not your property, how can the product be your property? Therefore, I can't own my property. The idea of ownership for him was logically incoherent. Important thing was, I am a trustee of what I have made. I don't own it. I am a trustee. This means what? That bit of it I can use for myself, a bit for my family, the rest a bit for my workers, the rest for society. Now, that is the guiding principle of your economic life. You can ask yourself, Omar would tell me, what is the business model for this kind of man? What is the role of workers? And he said on many occasions, almost like a German model, he said workers should be involved in running the factory or whatever, in running the business. That workers have a right, the owner has a right, based on different considerations, and therefore what we need to do is they should jointly run the business. And business should be guided not just entirely by profit, but by public good. And when profit is made, it can be divided, it should be, between the individual concern for his living and for society around him and for his workers. So that is his guiding principle. He didn't spell it out, and again he kept changing. When he advanced as far as this, there were quite a few people, socialists like Jayaprakash Narayan and a few others, said, look, we part company with you. You should be more left-wing, socialist. And Gandhi said, I am a socialist. And he explained why in a dialogue and a declaration by Dantwala, called the Dantwala Declaration, which Gandhi signed. And the Dantwala Declaration said, no man has a right to property, capitalism is evil, all the left-wing ideas. But at the same time, Gandhi knew that state shouldn't be owning those things. State ownership is worse, because that, as he said, is the combination of economic power with political power. The state not only has political power, but can starve you by denying you job. So communism is out, capitalism is out, and this is where Gandhi kept experimenting with all kinds of things. And when he was asked, again you can see his search, when he was asked, which one of the capitalists in India has come anywhere near becoming a trustee? Gandhi paused a long time, and he said, no one, but Bajaj to some extent. That not the Birlas, not the Tatas, he was suspicious of both of them, but he says Jannadas Bajaj comes close, but only just a little. In which case, what happens to the idea of trusteeship? If he couldn't implement it, or if trusted lieutenants couldn't implement it, for all kinds of selfish reasons, what is the next thing? And he kept thinking, and again his views changed. I don't want to go into it some other time. And the last thing I think in Gandhi's case, which is very important and relevant to us, is his anatomy of power. He had suffered so much all his life. In South Africa, thrown out of a train for daring to travel first class, or thrown off a pavement for daring to walk past President Kruger's palace. In all those cases, and he was locked up, first anti-Asian act in South Africa. He was arrested, locked up in a prison, which he spent with two criminals, one Chinese, one black. They were engaged in indecent activities, and Gandhi kept fearing that he might be attacked by them. I won't go into all this, but Gandhi couldn't sleep all night because he was afraid of being a victim of homosexual attack, because this is what those people were doing. The man, and then he came to India, saw the Rolatwala Act, Jallianwala Bagh, all those things, and he kept suffering inequality and oppression. And his greatest contribution, I would expect, is if you have suffered so much, seen so much inequality, you ask yourself, why are people so unequal? Why are people so oppressive? How can it be reduced? What I call the anatomy of power led Gandhi to one important conclusion, very important conclusion, just one, but one, which is people treat you like this because the victims allow themselves to be treated like this. Which is why he told Indians, those who behave like worms should not complain if others trample on them. Or Indians were busy doing deals privately, which they were not allowed to do. And Gandhi said, when shall we learn to rebel against ourselves? Now this idea of rebelling against our own tendency to give in. So from all this, Gandhi said, look, it's ultimately the victim's cooperation that sustains the victimizer's oppression. If only so nobody is innocent. The victims are never innocent. The question therefore is, can the victims stand up and say, we refuse to cooperate? When Jallianwala Bagh happened in India, where 360 people or whatever were killed, who fired on them? Indians. Gandhi said, we have been collaborating, not just cooperating, collaborating with the British. We provide them with lawyers, provide them with clerks, provide them with taxes. If we tomorrow say, sorry, we don't cooperate with you at all, what happens to this colonial power whose investment in India was so little? So few Britishers, so few British soldiers. Could they have survived if all the Indians said no? So Gandhi said, started the non-cooperation movement. The point of this is, if you want to end the system of oppression, the victim should recognize that they have been complicit in their own oppression, and they should stand up and have the courage to say, sorry, we will not. When he said this, people who were inclined to violence, the terrorists with whom he was constantly carrying on the dialogue, said, but look, this is rubbish. Violence shows bravery in a way that non-violence is not. Non-violence is cowardly, feminine and all that. Violence is the answer. And Gandhi said the violence is an act of cowardice, it's not an act of courage. In the dark you shoot a man, but in his presence during the day you are frightened. You are so frightened you can't do anything, you can only kill him when it is dark. Non-violence is an act of courage, violence is an act of cowardice. A non-violent man, therefore, a victim of oppression, would stand up and say, I will not do this, and he has the courage to say this. But the other man might kill, which is why Gandhi had earlier point I made, that non-violent person would cultivate the art of dying. That you can be truly, truly, truly non-violent only if you are not attached to life as an absolute value. Consumption is limited, climate change, it has important implications for climate change. Once you recognize your attitude to life is different. You don't want to die, that's not the point. You don't court death, but you don't mind it. If it comes, it comes. Now that, I think, ultimately is at the heart of Gandhi's thinking as he grew old. And that's something whose implications I have not sorted out. Because for 2,000 years, political scientists and others have written about society on the assumption that every man fears death. He fears death. That's why you have armies and all that. If the assumption is totally reversed, and you had a society full of men who are not afraid of dying, what will happen? Well, on that note, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you for that session. I've been struck very deeply last time when I heard you and again today with the fact that you don't deify Gandhi, that you actually raise questions about the way he behaved and the way he spoke and wrote, and you open it up for the human element of Gandhi to come in. So I appreciate that greatly. And the other thing that I've experienced today has been, there's been a huge variety of people from so many different backgrounds that have come together, but there's been an atmosphere of immediate friendship right from the time that we arrived. And I think that's because what's brought us together is the Gandhian principles, that we all appreciate those and want to see them happen in the world, not just in our lives, but in the world. And so I think that's been the thread that's held everything together, not just the subjects, but that undercurrent of feeling that we've had. I asked myself, what new things did I learn? And the things about peace and non-violence, I'm a little familiar with. The things about climate change, I'm very familiar with. But the whole discussion about the new economy, that was very new for me. And so it was very interesting to hear about the employees sharing ownership. That was really wonderful and an amazing vision of hope for the future. What I was shocked by was the news of the Wall Street Journal that's talking about investment before the apocalypse. That was a shock. Now, the state of the human mind that's not thinking about the suffering of human beings, but is wanting people to capitalize on the suffering and the conditions that lead to that. There's a word we have in India to describe the state of affairs that lead to that situation, and that's Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the Dark Age. But not just the Dark Age, the darkest end of the Dark Age. But what happens after the Dark Age? The Age of Light, the Age of Truth. Things don't finish when there's a straight line, there's a beginning and an end. But you touched upon the subject of death and beyond death, not just in terms of the legacy that you leave behind here in the physical dimension, but I think I would also raise the subject of something beyond and the concept of eternity. And when there's an eternal awareness, then you go not just from light into dark, but it's a circle. And so you go from dark back again into light. And so I believe that that's the period that we're in. A lot of turbulence. When there's major change, there's always going to be turbulence. When hot and cold air collide together, it creates hurricanes and tempests and all sorts of things. But in this case, the dark, and we're seeing very, very dark energies all around. But what's coming up is the vision of hope and the light that's entering the world in terms of so many different aspects, holistic understanding of education, of medicine, of architecture. We're talking about vegetarian diet. When I was at school in London in the 50s, I told them I was vegetarian, and my mother had told them I was vegetarian. And they gave me cold boiled potatoes and lettuce. That was my lunch. I stopped having school lunches and took my own. But you can see how we've changed so much to the point where now everywhere there's always an offer for vegetarian or even vegan diet. It's become the norm. It's not odd anymore. So I've mentioned just a couple of things, but hope for the future, definitely. And so I think that I'd like to close on that note, a vision of hope. I propose that I share my thoughts as I reflect in silence. It's vocal, but it's an inner silence. And I invite you to follow these ideas. And it's very, very simple. You don't have to sit on the floor. You'll be pleased to know. But I'll just share my own thoughts as I reflect, and if you wish to do something else internally, that's of course your choice. But we can move together on this inner journey. Turning my attention inwards, I reflect on the concept of compassion, love, and truth. The things that are the foundation of civilization, because they're the very embodiment of the human spirit. These are the qualities that the human spirit comprises of. As I go on this inner journey, I ask myself, where does peace reside? Certainly not out there, but somewhere within. Within the inner being, the spirit. And I connect with that being within. And I enter that space that only I can enter. That sacred space where peace lies. And as I connect with the peace within, I begin to be aware of how comfortable it feels, how natural it feels, and I realize that this is my natural state of being. Connecting with peace, a door opens within the soul, and I become aware of the love that resides within. For a long time, I have been looking for peace outside. I was searching for love and happiness out there. And now I understand peace, happiness, love, and truth reside within. And the door of peace allows my heart to expand and connect with the love and compassion within. I've been exposed to many stories, much illusion, so much falsehood. And yet, when I go deep inside, the seed of truth still lies there. And I begin to appreciate the connection of truth and purity. I've heard of Gandhi's experiments with purity, but now, in the awareness of the inner being, it's not just what I've heard. Now I'm connecting with the truth within. And I realize that I'd forgotten about purity. But purity is the original state of the human spirit. In my original form, in my natural state of being, these are the qualities, the values that I possess. And I look out into the world and I see that shining light sparkling in each one's forehead. And I feel the bond that connects me with every human being, my global family, the one human family. And I see each being radiating those qualities. As the curtain of illusion falls away and the darkness is dispelled, the light within shines. And the power of this light extends out to all forms of life. And those vibrations of peace, of love, reach all creatures so that they feel safe and protected. And these vibrations reach the entire planet and all the elements of nature. And as peace is restored to nature, as purity and cleanliness comes back to nature, the anger of the elements dissolves, and nature returns to a state of harmony. As we return to our own awareness of our inner dignity based on truth, on values, we return to a world of respect. Respect for each other, all forms of life, and nature. I hold this awareness of my inner being, my true identity, and I come back to the moment here and now. But I keep this connection with who I truly am. Thank you. A big thank you to you and the Gandhi Foundation and the huge team that has been working hard to put this together, both from the Brahma Kumaris as well as the Gandhi Foundation. And thank you to all of you for being here with us all day. Om Shanti.
Allow Sister Jayanti to have the last word. even if I'm in a place where she is the boss. I think this has been an absolutely wonderful workshop. Certainly, and Gandhi Foundation is privileged, ma'am, to associate itself with you. You have been an absolutely charming, graceful, very wise lady who guided our deliberations and whose presence has a certain sobering and disciplining influence on some of us. You have been marvelous host. Your colleagues have been absolutely wonderful. There she is, Rachel. She was very helpful. And your entire staff of colleagues have been marvelous. In this conflict-ridden world, for Gandhi seminar to take place in an island of love and goodwill is a privilege. Thank you very much.